My name is Cameron. I am 70 years old. I spent my entire adult life building a logistics empire just to watch my family try to tear it apart for parts. The crushing weight hit my chest right after I finished reviewing the quarterly freight reports in my home office. It felt like a cinder block had been dropped directly onto my ribs. Pain radiated down my left arm and up into my jaw. I managed to dial emergency services on my desk phone before my vision blurred into a sea of black. I collapsed onto the hardwood floor. My last thought before losing consciousness was a worry about a delayed shipment in Chicago. I woke up to the jarring sway of an ambulance. Harsh fluorescent lights glared directly above my face. The siren wailed outside. A young paramedic leaned over me. He held my personal cell phone to his ear. He was speaking frantically. I could hear the tinny voice echoing from the phone speaker. It was Valerie. She is my wife of 40 years. The paramedic clearly informed her that my condition was critical. He urged her to meet us at the emergency room immediately. Valerie sighed. The sound was sharp and intensely irritated. It carried perfectly over the speakerphone. She told the paramedic I always overreacted to indigestion. She explicitly instructed him not to call back until the morning. Her annual spring gala was starting in 3 hours. She complained that the florist had just delivered the wrong orchids and she was too busy fixing their mistake to deal with a hospital visit. She ordered him to stop wasting her time. Then she hung up the phone. The line went dead. The sheer audacity of her words struck me harder than the cardiac event itself. My chest seized violently. A massive surge of adrenaline mixed with pure disbelief. The paramedic yelled an order to the driver. The heart monitor beside my head let out a continuous piercing shriek. The world simply vanished. I ceased to exist. For 22 seconds, I was clinically dead. I died in the back of that speeding vehicle while my wife worried about the color of her flower arrangements. I jolted back to life with the brutal impact of a defibrillator. My back arched off the stretcher. My lungs burned as I gasped for air. The ambulance slammed to a halt. We arrived at the emergency room bay. A team of doctors swarmed me. They shouted medical jargon and commands. They wheeled me into a trauma bay. I ignored their voices. I grabbed the paramedic by the arm. My grip was weak but determined. I demanded my phone. He hesitated. I demanded it again with a tone that brokered no argument. He handed the device over. I have an automatic call recording application installed on my phone. I use it constantly for business negotiations to ensure verbal contracts are honored. I opened the application log. I found the most recent recording. I pressed play. I listened to my wife dismiss my potential death. Her voice was entirely devoid of panic. It lacked any trace of love. It lacked basic human decency. She was merely annoyed. I was an inconvenience to her social calendar. She prioritized a room full of pretentious strangers over the life of the man who paid for the champagne they were about to drink. A nurse approached my bed. She tried to push a thick IV needle into the back of my hand. I ripped it out instantly. Drops of blood splattered onto the pristine white hospital sheets. The attending physician rushed over. He told me I was risking my life by moving. He warned that my heart could give out again at any moment if I did not stay for observation and emergency surgery. I looked him dead in the eye. I told him I had survived far worse in my lifetime. 40 years ago, I built my freight company from a single rusted delivery truck. I had no investors. I had no safety net. I drove 60 hours straight across the country, eating stale gas station crackers and fighting off severe sleep hallucinations. I did that just to secure my first major distribution contract. I forced my body past the limits of human endurance to build an empire. I knew exactly how to survive exhaustion. I knew how to manage physical pain. I was absolutely not going to die in a sterile hospital bed while my wife entertained her country club friends on my dime. I demanded the against medical advice discharge papers. The medical staff argued with me. I silenced them by stating I would call my corporate lawyers and sue the hospital for false imprisonment if they did not hand me a pen. They brought the forms. I signed the discharge papers with a steady hand. The nurses looked at me with a mixture of shock and pity. I did not need their pity. I needed mobility. I walked out the sliding glass doors of the emergency room. The night air hit my face. My chest ached with every breath. I ignored the pain. I hailed a passing taxi. I gave the driver the address to my estate. It is a sprawling mansion I purchased with decades of sweat stress and high blood pressure. The ride was completely silent. I stared out the window at the passing city lights. I used the time to calculate my next move. I did not feel rage. Rage is a chaotic emotion that leads to mistakes. I felt absolute chilling clarity. My wife had made her priorities explicitly clear. I was now a ghost. I decided to act like one. The taxi approached my neighborhood. I ordered the driver to drop me off at the end of my street. I handed him a crisp $100 bill and told him to keep the change. I walked the remaining block on foot. I stayed close to the shadows cast by the large oak trees lining the sidewalk. I needed to avoid being seen by the valet drivers who were busy parking luxury cars along my sweeping driveway. The street was lined with vehicles belonging to people I despised, people Valerie courted for social status. I bypassed the grand front entrance entirely. I walked through the side gate and approached the service door near the kitchen. The heavy scent of roasted duck and expensive floral arrangements permeated the air. Loud music and boisterous laughter echoed down the hallway. I quietly unlocked the service door. I stepped inside my own home. I stood completely still in the dark utility corridor. I listened to the unmistakable clinking of crystal champagne glasses coming from the main dining hall. The party was in full swing. My wife was celebrating while she believed I was lying in a hospital bed recovering from a fatal heart attack. I leaned against the cool wall. My heart pounded a steady, angry rhythm. The 22 seconds of death had completely reset my perspective on my family. Every sacrifice I ever made was currently being toasted away in the next room. I took a deep breath. I stepped further into the shadows. The adjustment had officially begun. I moved silently past the pantry. I avoided the catering staff bustling around the kitchen island. They were too busy plating hors d'oeuvres to notice the owner of the house slipping past them. I needed to reach my private study before anyone spotted me. I needed to secure my assets before the night was over. The sound of the string quartet playing in the ballroom mocked the silence I demanded. I reached the edge of the hallway leading to the grand foyer. I stopped. The voices of my daughter and son-in-law drifted clearly from the adjacent sitting room. I held my breath and listened. I pressed myself against the cool plaster of the service hallway wall. My chest throbbed with a dull ache, a residual reminder of the 22 seconds I had spent clinically dead. Yet the physical pain was dwarfed by the profound icy clarity settling over my mind. From my concealed vantage point, I had a clear line of sight into the grand dining hall. The room was a spectacle of opulence. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm, flattering glow over the elite of Fairfield. Waitstaff maneuvered effortlessly through the crowd, balancing silver trays of expensive hors d'oeuvres. At the center of it all stood Valerie. She was holding court, a flute of vintage champagne in her hand, her laughter ringing out clear and vibrant. She wore a stunning emerald gown that I had purchased for her just last month. She looked radiant. She looked entirely unburdened by the fact that she believed her husband was currently fighting for his life in a sterile hospital room. She was describing a recent charity auction to the mayor's wife, her voice animated, devoid of a single note of anxiety or grief. My attention shifted as I spotted Alicia and Bradley standing near the towering French doors that led out to the terrace. They were holding their own drinks, their heads leaned close together in what looked like conspiratorial glee. I edged closer, using the shadow of a large decorative urn to obscure my presence. The ambient noise of the party masked my approach. I pulled my phone from my pocket. I opened the recording app once again. I pressed the red button and pointed the microphone toward them. Alicia took a delicate sip of her champagne and smiled. "So, how long do we have before we have to deal with the old man again?" she asked. Her tone was casual, as if she were inquiring about the arrival time of a delayed package. Bradley chuckled. He adjusted his tailored suit jacket. "The doctors told your mother it was a massive cardiac event. He'll be bedridden for months, assuming he even makes it out of ICU. He won't be in any condition to handle corporate affairs." "Perfect," Alicia replied, "because we need to move on the warehouse property immediately. The zoning board meets next Tuesday." "I've already drafted the proposals," Bradley said, his voice brimming with unearned arrogance. "The main freight warehouse sits on prime real estate. Once we bulldoze that eyesore, the new parking structure for my tech hub will be finalized. It's the perfect collateral for the next funding round." I stood motionless in the dark, the phone steadily recording every word. The main freight warehouse was the beating heart of my empire. It was the central hub where 70% of our nationwide logistics were processed. Bradley was talking about dismantling the core of my business, the livelihood of hundreds of my employees, to build a parking lot for a vanity project. This was not a sudden burst of ambition on his part. Bradley was a serial failure. Over the past 5 years, he had launched 3 separate tech startups. Each one was a disaster fueled by incompetence and massive overspending. I had bailed him out every single time to save Alicia from public humiliation. The bailouts came with strict repayment schedules and mandatory financial oversight. Bradley had ignored every condition, treating my loans as gifts. I had enabled his delusion of competence. Now he was preparing to cannibalize my life's work to feed his ego. "Are you sure you can get the bulldozers moving before he realizes what's happening?" Alicia asked. "I don't need him to realize anything," Bradley scoffed. "Valerie has his medical proxy. If he's incapacitated, she signs the release forms, and we all know Valerie will sign whatever we put in front of her as long as it keeps her allowance flowing. We'll present it as a necessary corporate restructuring. By the time he's well enough to ask questions, the concrete will already be poured." I stopped the recording. I slipped the phone back into my pocket. The betrayal was complete. It was not just a lack of care. It was a calculated, opportunistic dismantling of my legacy. They were vultures circling a body they believed was already dead. I did not step out of the shadows. I did not confront them. Confrontation would give them warning. It would allow them to spin lies and build a defense. I needed them to remain ignorant of my resurrection. I turned away from the dining hall. I moved silently through the back corridors of the mansion, heading toward the east wing. The music from the string quartet faded as I navigated the familiar hallways. I reached the heavy oak door of my private study. I used my master key to unlock it and stepped inside. The room was dark, smelling faintly of leather and old paper. I closed the door quietly and engaged the deadbolt. I walked behind my mahogany desk and approached the large oil painting hanging on the far wall. I swung the painting aside to reveal the heavy steel door of my hidden wall safe. This safe held the fail-safes of my empire. It contained emergency power of attorney documents, bearer bonds, offshore account details, and the master ledger of all secondary corporate accounts. These were the documents that dictated total control over the company in the event of my death or incapacitation. I input the 6-digit combination. I placed my thumb on the biometric scanner. The heavy internal locking mechanism clicked open. I pulled the steel door wide. I froze. The safe was completely empty. The shelves were bare. Not a single document, not a single bond remained. The fail-safes were gone. The cold steel of the safe door chilled my fingertips as I stared into the dark hollow cavity embedded in the wall. Every emergency protocol, every fail-safe I had meticulously drafted over 40 years of building my logistics empire was gone. The thick manila folders containing my medical proxy, the durable power of attorney, the bearer bonds, and the master ledger of all secondary corporate accounts had simply vanished into thin air. My family had not just left me to die alone in a sterile hospital bed. They had preemptively robbed me blind while my heart was literally stopping. The sheer scale of their betrayal crystallized in my mind with terrifying clarity. Valerie had the combination. She was the only other person on Earth who knew the exact sequence of numbers required to unlock this vault. She had handed over the keys to my kingdom before the paramedics even had the chance to declare my heart stopped. I ran my hand over the bare metal shelves, feeling the fine layer of dust where my legacy used to sit. They had stripped me of my legal armor. They assumed my death was a certainty and moved with breathtaking speed to carve up the spoils of my lifelong labor. I closed the heavy steel door. I spun the dial to wipe the combination. I did not feel panic. Panic is a luxury for men who do not know how to fight back. I felt an absolute calculating coldness settling deep into my bones. I was a man who had navigated cutthroat union disputes, survived hostile corporate takeovers, and built a fleet of trucks from absolute nothing. My own family had just declared war on a man who practically invented ruthless survival. They thought I was an easy mark. They were dead wrong. A sudden burst of loud, raucous laughter echoed from the grand hallway, breaking my intense focus. I stepped away from the concealed wall painting and pressed my ear against the heavy oak door of my study. Heavy, uncoordinated footsteps approached the grand foyer. It was my son Jordan and his wife Heather. They had arrived incredibly late to Valerie's extravagant spring gala, and they were making sure everyone knew it. The sharp clatter of Heather's designer heels striking the imported marble floor was unmistakable. Her voice was slurred, pitched high with the reckless, arrogant confidence of someone who had consumed far too much expensive wine before even reaching the main event. She was practically shouting to a group of Valerie's pretentious country club friends near the entryway. I listened closely as Heather boasted about closing a massive deal on a new coastal mansion. She loudly proclaimed they were paying entirely in cash, bypassing the bank completely. She specifically used the phrase family equity to explain their sudden massive surge in liquid wealth. The words twisted like a rusted blade in my gut. 5 years ago, I sat in a dimly lit, freezing warehouse with two very dangerous men and paid off a staggering gambling debt to save Jordan's life. The debt had been massive enough to get his legs broken, or worse. He had wept at my feet. He had sworn on his mother's life that he would never touch a card, a dice table, or a roulette wheel again. He promised to dedicate himself to honest work within my company. I gave him a second chance, a clean slate, and a lucrative position in my procurement division. Hearing Heather brag about millions in liquid cash meant only one thing. Jordan had relapsed hard, but this time he was using my stolen assets to fund his uncontrollable addiction and his wife's insatiable materialism. They were leveraging my stolen bearer bonds to buy beachfront property while they thought my corpse was cooling in a hospital morgue. The disrespect was profound, calculated, and entirely unforgivable. I silently engaged the heavy brass deadbolt on the study door. The mechanical click was barely audible over the pulsating bass of the string quartet playing down the hall in the ballroom. I walked over to my massive mahogany desk and picked up the secure landline. I bypassed the standard household network and dialed the direct private number of my corporate attorney, Gallagher. He answered on the second ring. His voice was sharp, alert, and instantly ready for business despite the late hour of the night. I did not waste time with pleasantries or dramatic explanations. I simply told him I was alive, I was standing inside the estate, and my family had initiated a hostile financial coup. I informed him the wall safe had been completely emptied of all power of attorney documents, proxy forms, and emergency funds. Gallagher did not gasp, sigh, or ask unnecessary emotional questions. He was a ruthless operator who thrived in the chaos of corporate warfare. He immediately asked for my exact orders. I instructed him to initiate the Scorched Earth Financial Protocol immediately. I ordered him to freeze every single secondary account linked to the logistics company. I demanded the immediate severance of all joint lines of credit attached to Valerie, Jordan, Alicia, and Bradley. I told him to flag the missing power of attorney documents as stolen property with the Federal Banking Commission, so any attempt to use them would instantly trigger a high-level fraud alert. Gallagher typed furiously on his keyboard, the rapid clacking echoing through the phone speaker. He confirmed the absolute asset freeze would take effect across all global banking servers within 3 minutes. Any platinum card they swiped, any large check they wrote, any wire transfer they attempted to initiate for that coastal mansion would bounce with a hard, unforgiving decline. I instructed him to prepare a detailed financial dossier on Jordan's recent real estate acquisitions and trace the exact origin of the stolen funds. Gallagher assured me the digital locks were firmly in place. The endless money supply my family had grown completely accustomed to was officially dead. I thanked him and hung up the receiver. The sudden silence in my private study was intensely heavy. The air felt charged with the electric anticipation of the devastating trap I had just set into motion. I walked slowly around the massive desk and lowered myself into my leather executive chair. The old leather groaned softly under my weight, a familiar sound of authority. I folded my hands together and rested them on the polished wood surface. I stared straight ahead at the locked door. The warm glow of the brass desk lamp cast long, intimidating shadows across the walls lined with awards and photographs of my trucking fleet. I waited with the absolute patience of a predator. The music from the gala outside seemed to swell a chaotic, joyful symphony, completely masking the financial execution I had just orchestrated from the shadows. Then the heavy brass doorknob rattled. Someone was trying to get in. The rattling grew violent, impatient, entirely lacking any respect for my private space. It was the frantic energy of someone entitled, someone who believed they owned everything in the house. A heavy key slid into the lock, bypassing my deadbolt with a harsh metallic click. The door violently swung inward, hitting the wall with a loud, echoing thud. Bradley marched into the room, his face flushed with arrogance and unearned entitlement. A thick stack of stolen corporate files was gripped tightly in his hands. He was laughing to himself, muttering about bulldozer permits. He took 2 confident strides forward before his eyes finally adjusted to the dim lighting of the study. He stopped dead in his tracks. The smug, victorious expression completely drained from his face in less than a second. The color vanished from his cheeks, leaving him a sickening, terrified shade of pale white. The files slipped from his loosening grip and scattered across the expensive Persian rug. He stared at me, sitting silently behind the desk. He was staring at a man he fully believed was dead. Bradley stood frozen in the doorway of my private study. The thick stack of stolen corporate files slipped from his trembling hands. the papers scattered across the expensive Persian rug, his face drained of all color. He looked exactly like a man who had just seen a ghost. I sat perfectly still in my leather executive chair. I kept my hands folded on the polished mahogany desk. I did not raise my voice. I did not blink. I simply stared at him. The silence stretched between us, thick and suffocating. Bradley opened his mouth to speak, but no sound came out. His arrogant swagger had completely vanished. He took a stumbling step backward. He bumped into the doorframe. He turned and sprinted down the hallway. I heard his frantic footsteps echoing toward the grand foyer. He was running to find his puppet master. He was running to find my wife. I remained in my chair. I waited. Less than 2 minutes later, the sharp, aggressive click of Valerie's heels approached the study. She marched through the open doorway. She wore her stunning emerald gown. Diamonds glittered around her neck. Her face was contorted into a mask of pure, unadulterated fury. She slammed the heavy oak door shut behind her to block out the sounds of the string quartet from the ballroom. She did not rush forward to embrace me. She did not ask how I survived a fatal heart attack. She did not shed a single tear of relief. She glared at me with absolute disgust. She crossed her arms over her chest. She demanded to know what I was doing out of the hospital. She hissed that my pale, sickly appearance was completely ruining the aesthetic of her spring gala. She said my presence was a massive liability to the social mood of her guests. She accused me of being incredibly selfish for discharging myself and walking into her party unannounced. She treated my near-death experience as a personal insult to her event planning. I listened to her venomous words. I absorbed every single insult without a flinch. This was her standard tactical maneuver. Valerie had weaponized my health for over a decade. Whenever she wanted to control my environment, she cited my high blood pressure. She used my medical history as an airtight excuse to systematically isolate me from my oldest friends. She canceled my weekend fishing trips with the retired truck drivers who helped me build the logistics empire from the ground up. She blocked calls from my former business partners. She told them the stress of their conversations was simply too much for my fragile heart. She created an echo chamber in our mansion where her voice was the only one that mattered. She painted herself as the devoted, protective wife to the outside world while slowly locking me inside a gilded cage. I saw the cage clearly now. The bars were forged entirely from her insatiable greed. She pointed a manicured finger toward the hallway. She ordered me to go upstairs to the master bedroom immediately. She told me to stay completely out of sight until every single guest left the property. I looked at her pointing finger. A younger version of myself would have roared in defiance. The man who negotiated with ruthless transportation union bosses in the 80s would have torn the room apart. But that man was currently playing a different, much more lethal game. I needed her to believe she held absolute power. I needed her to feel completely secure in her false victory. I let my shoulders slump forward. I relaxed my facial muscles to mimic extreme exhaustion and deep cognitive confusion. I allowed a slight pathetic tremor to enter my hands. I gripped the edge of the desk and pushed myself up slowly. I made a soft, pained sound in the back of my throat. I looked at the floor instead of meeting her eyes. I apologized. I made my voice weak and raspy. I told her the hospital lights were too bright and I just wanted to sleep in my own bed. I shuffled slowly around the massive desk. I kept my head bowed. I walked past the scattered corporate files on the rug without giving them a single glance. I portrayed a man utterly broken by his own failing body. I walked past Valerie's toward the door. I caught the faint, heavy scent of her expensive perfume. I glanced up for a fraction of a second. A sickening smirk stretched across her face. Her eyes gleamed with absolute triumph. She saw a dying old man who lacked the physical and mental capacity to fight back. She truly believed I had not noticed the empty wall safe. She believed her hostile takeover was completely secure. She turned her back on me and walked to a decorative mirror on the wall to adjust her diamond necklace. She prepared to return to her guests and her champagne. She told me to lock the bedroom door and turn out the lights. I shuffled down the long, empty hallway toward the east wing. I reached the master suite and closed the heavy door behind me. I locked the deadbolt. The act was officially over for the night. I stood up straight. I rolled my shoulders back. The sharp pain in my chest remained a dull ache, but my mind was operating with crystalline precision. I did not turn on the main overhead lights. I sat in the darkness on the edge of the king-sized bed. I listened to the muffled sounds of laughter and music filtering up from the ground floor. They were celebrating my demise. They were toasting to their newfound wealth with money purchased by the sweat of my brow. I spent the entire night sitting in that chair. I did not sleep for a single minute. I watched the shadows stretch and shift across the bedroom walls. I waited for the dawn. The sun eventually broke over the horizon. The harsh morning light poured through the tall windows. The mansion was finally dead silent. The catering staff had cleaned the ballroom and departed. Valerie was asleep in the guest suite at the far end of the hall. She had stopped sharing my room 3 years ago, claiming my irregular sleep schedule disrupted her rest. I stood up and walked into my ensuite bathroom. I turned on the vanity light. I stared at my reflection in the mirror. I looked older, grayer, and battered by the events of the previous day. However, my eyes were intensely alive. The 22 seconds of death had burned away every trace of my previous leniency. I opened the wooden medicine cabinet above the sink. I reached for my daily pill organizer. It is a clear plastic container separated by days of the week. I manage my own medication strictly to ensure optimal heart function. I popped open the compartment marked for Wednesday morning. I poured the pills into the palm of my hand. I immediately noticed a glaring discrepancy. My essential heart medication is a small pale blue tablet with a distinct numeric imprint on the back. The pill resting in the center of my palm was slightly larger. It was a chalky white capsule. I picked it up between my thumb and index finger. I brought it closer to the harsh vanity light. The numeric imprint matched a heavy pharmaceutical-grade sedative. It was the exact kind of chemical restraint used to induce severe lethargy and extreme cognitive impairment in unstable psychiatric patients. The realization slammed into my chest like a physical blow. They were not just waiting for me to die from natural causes. They were actively taking aggressive steps to erase my mind. They wanted me docile, severely confused, and entirely incapable of defending my logistics empire in a court of law. The empty wall safe was only their first financial move. The medical trap was their next lethal step. I closed my fist tightly around the white capsule. The cold reality of their strategy settled into my bones. They were not merely waiting for my heart to fail. They were actively accelerating my demise. They wanted to imprison me inside my own mind. A dead man's estate goes through probate. A living but mentally incompetent man hands total control directly to his medical proxy. Valerie held that proxy. She intended to use this heavy sedative to bypass the legal complexities of my death and seize the company while my heart still beat. The sound of footsteps echoed in the hallway. I quickly dropped the white capsule into the pocket of my silk robe. I grabbed a harmless vitamin from the bottom shelf of the cabinet. I placed it on the counter just as the bathroom door swung open. Valerie stood in the doorway. She held a crystal glass of water. She wore a perfectly tailored morning suit. Her face was a mask of counterfeit concern. She told me it was time for my heart medication. She insisted on watching me take it to ensure my health was stabilized. I did not argue. Arguing requires energy. Arguing alerts the enemy to your awareness. I picked up the harmless vitamin. I placed it on my tongue. I took the glass of water from her hands. I took a deep swallow. I tilted my head back to demonstrate compliance. I handed the empty glass back to her. Valerie smiled. It was the same triumphant smirk she wore the previous night in the study. She told me to go back to bed and rest. She promised to handle all the household affairs so I could recover in peace. She turned and walked out of the suite. I spat the vitamin into the sink. I washed it down the drain. I reached into my robe pocket and retrieved the heavy sedative. I wrapped it in a tissue and shoved it deep into the trash can beneath a pile of wet paper towels. The chemical trap was bypassed. Now I needed to play the role they had scripted for me. If they believed I was drugged, they would move carelessly. They would make mistakes. Less than an hour later, a firm knock sounded on the bedroom door. Bradley walked in without waiting for an invitation. He was accompanied by a man I had never seen before. The stranger wore a cheap gray suit and carried a scuffed black medical bag. His posture was rigid. His eyes darted around the luxurious master suite with hungry calculation. He did not possess the calm, authoritative aura of a legitimate physician. He looked exactly like a man who sold signatures to the highest bidder. Bradley stood at the foot of my bed. He puffed out his chest. He introduced the stranger as Dr. Aris. Bradley claimed he had hired a private concierge specialist to conduct a routine wellness check following my cardiac event. He stated that the hospital doctors were incompetent and he wanted a second opinion to guarantee my recovery. The lie was so poorly constructed it was almost insulting. They had brought an unlicensed hack into my home to finish the job the sedative was supposed to start. I sat on the edge of the mattress. I let my shoulders slump heavily forward. I relaxed my facial muscles until my jaw hung slightly slack. I blinked slowly. I forced my eyes to appear vacant and unfocused. I simulated the exact lethargy and cognitive fog produced by heavy chemical tranquilizers. Bradley stepped closer. He pointed at me. He told the fake doctor that my condition had deteriorated rapidly overnight. He claimed I was wandering the halls in a state of severe dementia. He stated I no longer recognized my own family. Dr. Aris nodded solemnly. He opened his scuffed bag and pulled out a digital blood pressure cuff. He wrapped it around my arm. He did not even look at the reading. His entire examination was a theatrical performance designed to legally cover their tracks. I leaned into the charade. I tapped into a memory from 4 decades ago. In 1983, my freight company was paralyzed by a massive transportation strike. The local union was controlled by ruthless mob bosses who used intimidation and violence to maintain their monopoly. I was a young, exhausted trucker facing men who broke legs for a living. I sat across a scarred metal table from them in a freezing warehouse. They demanded 70% of my profits. They thought I was desperate. They thought I was stupid. I played the fool. I stuttered through the negotiations. I acted terrified. I let them completely underestimate my intelligence. I allowed them to feel absolute power. By the time they signed the contracts, I had legally secured the shipping routes and trapped them in a web of impenetrable corporate loopholes. I broke their monopoly without throwing a single punch. Playing the fool is never a weakness. It is the most devastating tactical advantage a man can possess. It invites the enemy to expose their throat. Dr. Aris shined a small penlight into my eyes. He asked me basic cognitive questions. He asked me to state my full name. He asked me to identify the current year. He asked me to name the current president. I slurred my words perfectly. I mumbled a year that was 2 decades in the past. I stared blankly at the expensive wallpaper behind his head. I let a small line of drool pool at the corner of my mouth. I wiped it away with a trembling, uncoordinated hand. Bradley crossed his arms. He let out a loud theatrical sigh. He told the doctor it was tragic to see a great man reduced to an empty shell. He urged the doctor to proceed with the necessary paperwork to protect the family estate from my failing mind. I decided to give them a masterpiece. I looked directly at Bradley. I narrowed my eyes as if struggling to recognize a face from the distant past. I called him Jordan. I asked him why he lost the state championship baseball game. I asked him where my old hunting dog had gone. I babbled incoherently about a delayed shipment of auto parts from Detroit. I painted the picture of a shattered, useless mind completely detached from reality. Dr. Aris stepped back from the bed. He packed his penlight into his bag. He shook his head with mock sympathy. He declared my cognitive decline was severe and irreversible. He stated I was a danger to myself and entirely unfit to manage complex financial or corporate affairs. Bradley smiled. He did not even try to hide his excitement. He asked the doctor if he had the official documentation ready. Dr. Aris nodded. He reached into the side pocket of his cheap bag. He produced a crisp, pre-typed legal document. It was a formal declaration of medical and cognitive incompetence. The paperwork had been drafted long before they even entered the room. The entire examination was a sham. Dr. Aris clicked a gold fountain pen. He signed the bottom line with a swift, practiced motion. He stamped the paper with a medical seal. He handed the official certificate directly to Bradley. In return, Bradley reached into his tailored suit jacket. He pulled out a thick white envelope. It was bulging with cash. He handed it to the fake doctor. The transaction occurred right in front of my face. They did not care to conceal the bribe. They believed I was chemically lobotomized. They believed I was completely blind to their treason. Dr. Aris tipped his hat, pocketed the envelope, and swiftly exited the master suite. He had done his job. Bradley stared at the signed document, his eyes wide with manic greed. He held the key to the entire logistics empire in his hands. He possessed the legal authority to bulldoze the main warehouse and liquidate my assets to fund his vanity projects. He practically vibrated with adrenaline. The heavy oak door swung open. Valerie marched into the room. She did not ask about my health. She did not ask the doctor for a prognosis. She walked straight up to Bradley. She snatched the signed certificate of incompetence right out of his hands. She held the paper up to the light. She admired the signature like it was a priceless diamond. A cruel, victorious laugh escaped her lips. She completely ignored my presence on the bed. I was no longer a husband. I was a legal technicality she had successfully bypassed. She turned on her heel. She immediately pulled her gold-plated cell phone from her designer handbag. She bypassed her standard contacts and dialed a direct private line. I listened closely. She asked to speak directly to the chief loan officer at the state bank. The man owed his entire career to my initial investments. Valerie confidently identified herself as my legal medical proxy. She stated I was permanently incapacitated. She demanded the immediate execution of a massive multi-million-dollar corporate loan against the freight company's primary equity. She ordered the funds transferred to a secondary holding account within the hour. The trap was sprung. She believed she had won. Valerie held the forged medical certificate in her lap like a winning lottery ticket. The heavy official cardstock felt like the ultimate key to her absolute freedom. She sat in the passenger seat of Bradley's leased luxury sedan. She smoothed the pristine fabric of her designer skirt and stared out the window at the passing city blocks. Bradley navigated the morning traffic with aggressive, impatient swerves. He was already spending the money in his head. He talked rapidly about the heavy demolition crews he had lined up for the freight warehouse. He boasted about the zoning permits he planned to fast-track with a quick bribe to the city council. Valerie barely listened to his tech hub delusions. Her mind was entirely focused on the massive corporate credit line she was about to commandeer. She planned to liquidate enough equity by noon to completely remodel the east wing of the estate and permanently secure her status among the Fairfield elite. They pulled into the private parking garage of the First National Central Bank. The bank was a towering structure of limestone and dark glass. It represented the financial bedrock of the entire district. Valerie and Bradley walked through the polished revolving doors with their heads held high. They did not stop at the standard teller counter. They did not wait in the reception lobby for an appointment. They bypassed the customer service desks entirely and marched directly toward the heavy mahogany double doors at the back of the building. The brass nameplate on the door read Arthur Pendleton, Senior Branch Manager. Bradley pushed the door open without bothering to knock. Arthur was a man in his late 50s. He wore a conservative gray suit and wire-rimmed glasses. He looked up from his computer monitor as they invaded his private office. He did not look surprised. He stood up slowly and gestured toward the two leather guest chairs facing his desk. Valerie dropped the forged medical certificate directly onto his green desk blotter. She immediately launched into a rehearsed theatrical performance. She placed a hand over her heart and forced a tragic quiver into her voice. She explained that her husband had suffered a catastrophic mental break following his heart attack. She claimed Cameron was severely disoriented, highly unstable, and currently heavily sedated under round-the-clock medical supervision. Bradley stepped forward and slammed a thick stack of corporate transfer forms onto the desk right next to the certificate. He did not bother with fake sympathy. He demanded immediate action. He instructed Arthur to execute a $500,000 cash withdrawal from the primary corporate emergency reserve. He then ordered the immediate approval of a $5 million line of credit against the main logistics warehouse. He explicitly stated that Valerie was now the sole legal proxy for the estate and the freight company. He heavily tapped the forged signature of Dr. Eris with his index finger. He demanded the funds be wired into a newly established holding account within the hour. He warned Arthur that any delay would severely impact the operational flow of the company. He threatened to move all their lucrative corporate accounts to a rival bank if Arthur hesitated for even a second. Arthur Pendleton did not flinch. He did not reach for his pen. He did not look at the corporate transfer forms. He calmly picked up the forged medical certificate. He adjusted his glasses and read the document from top to bottom. He set the paper back down flat on the desk. He folded his hands together and looked directly into Valerie's eyes. He told her the request was entirely denied. Valerie froze. Her theatrical sadness vanished in a single instant. Her face hardened into a mask of pure indignation. She leaned over the desk and raised her voice. She demanded to know what gave him the right to question a certified medical document. She threatened to have his banking license revoked. She promised to ruin his career by the end of the business day. Arthur remained perfectly seated. He allowed her to finish her loud tirade before he finally spoke. He informed her that her threats were completely useless. He explained the absolute reality of the situation. At exactly 3 o'clock in the morning, Arthur received a call on his secure, unlisted residential line. The call came directly from Cameron. Arthur stated that Cameron sounded incredibly sharp, entirely focused, and entirely lucid. Cameron had explicitly warned Arthur that a fraudulent attempt to seize the corporate assets would happen before noon. Arthur explained that Cameron had legally triggered a Level 5 scorched earth financial protocol. Every single secondary account linked to the freight empire was hard frozen by federal banking mandate. The joint credit cards were permanently deactivated. The emergency reserves were entirely locked down. Bradley's face turned a violent shade of crimson. He slammed his fist onto the leather armrest of his chair. He yelled that Cameron was legally incompetent. He pointed at the forged document and screamed that it superseded any phone call made in the middle of the night. Arthur shook his head. He leaned forward and delivered a piece of history Valerie and Bradley had completely ignored. Arthur explained that 30 years ago he was a struggling loan officer on the verge of total bankruptcy. He had a failing business plan and zero collateral. Cameron Hayes was the only man in Fairfield who believed in his vision. Cameron personally co-signed Arthur's first commercial loan. Furthermore, Cameron owned the exact plot of commercial real estate this bank was currently built upon. He donated the land to the bank charter with a 99-year unbreakable covenant. Arthur owed his entire career, his personal wealth, and his professional standing directly to Cameron Hayes. His absolute loyalty belonged exclusively to the man who built the foundation, not the family trying to tear down the walls. Arthur stated he would gladly lose his banking license before he ever facilitated the theft of Cameron's legacy. Valerie stared at the bank manager in total shock. The vast financial safety net she had relied on for 40 years was suddenly gone. The plastic in her purse was effectively dead. She demanded a legal loophole. She demanded access to a single personal checking account for basic household expenses. Arthur shattered her final desperate hope. He explained the newly initiated biometric lock protocol. The estate accounts were no longer governed by standard signatures or simple medical proxies. Cameron had integrated an absolute military-grade security measure. No funds could move, no transfers could be authorized, and no credit lines could be established without two distinct verification keys. The bank required Cameron's live physical fingerprint on a digital scanner, followed immediately by a highly encrypted voice recognition passphrase spoken directly into the main banking terminal. The fake medical document was less than worthless. It was active criminal evidence. Arthur politely suggested they leave his office before he felt obligated to call the Federal Fraud Division to verify the medical authenticity of Dr. Aris. Bradley snatched the worthless certificate off the desk. He crumpled the heavy paper in his fist. He turned and stormed out of the office. He kicked the heavy mahogany door open, shattering the quiet professional atmosphere of the bank lobby. Valerie stood up on shaking legs. She was thoroughly humiliated. The grand remodel of her estate was dead. Her endless supply of luxury funding was severed. She hurried after Bradley, keeping her head down to avoid the judging stares of the bank tellers and security guards. They reached the private parking garage. Bradley threw open the door of the luxury sedan and dropped heavily into the driver's seat. He punched the leather steering wheel with enough force to crack the plastic housing on the steering column. His breathing was heavy and ragged. His grand vision for a tech hub parking lot was completely destroyed. Without access to the corporate credit line, his demolition crews would abandon the warehouse site by the afternoon. He shoved the key into the ignition and threw the vehicle into drive. The tires squealed violently against the concrete floor as he aggressively accelerated toward the exit ramp. Valerie sat in the passenger seat in absolute silence. Her mind raced wildly as she tried to calculate a new strategy. She needed leverage. She needed a powerful way to force Cameron to lift the biometric lock and restore her access to the accounts. Suddenly, the sharp ringing of her cell phone broke the suffocating tension inside the car. She reached into her designer handbag and pulled out the device. The caller ID flashed with her daughter-in-law's name. She swiped the screen to answer. She barely had time to say hello before a frantic, hysterical scream pierced the speaker. It was Heather. Heather was sobbing uncontrollably. Her voice was pitched with pure, unadulterated terror. She screamed that strange men had just kicked in the front door of their coastal rental property. She shrieked that they had dragged Jordan violently out of his bed. Heather cried into the phone, claiming Jordan had just been aggressively kidnapped by heavily armed loan sharks. The heavy oak doors of the mansion foyer crashed open with a violent thud. Heather stumbled into the grand entryway. Her expensive designer heels slipped on the polished marble floor. She was breathing heavily. Her mascara was smeared down her cheeks in thick, dark streaks. She completely ignored the household staff who stepped forward to assist her. She sprinted directly toward the east wing. She knew exactly where to find me. She did not care that her mother-in-law had just declared me chemically lobotomized and legally incompetent. Desperation completely overrides a fabricated medical diagnosis. She burst into my private study. I was still sitting behind the mahogany desk. I was maintaining the exact posture of a broken man. I let my jaw hang slightly slack. I kept my eyes dull and unfocused. Heather did not even pause to assess my condition. She slammed her hands down onto my desk. She shoved her glowing cell phone directly into my face. She screamed that Jordan was gone. She shrieked that dangerous men had taken him from their coastal rental property. I forced my hands to tremble violently. I reached out and took her phone. I stared at the photograph displayed on the screen. The image was meant to be terrifying. It showed Jordan tied to a wooden chair in a windowless room. His head was slumped forward. A dark bruise colored his left cheekbone. Thick, coarse ropes wrapped around his chest and arms. Two men stood behind him. Their faces were obscured by dark ski masks. One man held a heavy steel wrench. The other held up a piece of paper with today's date scribbled in black marker. Heather began to sob loudly. She paced back and forth across my Persian rug. She wailed that the men were ruthless loan sharks. She claimed Jordan owed them a massive gambling debt from a private poker game gone wrong. She said they demanded $50,000 in unmarked cash within the hour. She completely broke down and fell to her knees. She begged me to save her husband. She begged me to save my son. She stated they would permanently disfigure him if the money did not arrive on time. I studied the photograph intently. My trained eyes caught every single inconsistency. The lighting in the room was entirely too dramatic. It looked like a staged theater set rather than a gritty basement. The coarse ropes binding Jordan to the chair were visibly loose. They lacked any real tension. A man struggling for his life would pull the fibers taut. Jordan's hands rested comfortably on his lap. The dark bruise on his cheekbone lacked the distinct red swelling of fresh, blunt force trauma. It looked exactly like smeared theatrical makeup. The entire composition was an insult to my intelligence. Heather grabbed the edge of my desk. She demanded I authorize the ransom immediately. She explicitly ordered me to log into the main corporate banking portal. She yelled at me to use my physical fingerprint and my voice to override the biometric lock. She slipped up terribly. Valerie had only discovered the biometric lock an hour ago at the bank manager's office. Heather had supposedly been dealing with a violent home invasion all morning. There was absolutely no logical way she could know about the newly instituted banking security measures. The alliance between Valerie Bradley Heather and Jordan was operating in real-time panic. I maintained my terrified facade. I gasped for air. I clutched my chest as if my heart were failing again. I nodded rapidly. I told her I would pay anything to bring my boy home safely. I reached for my heavy laptop resting on the corner of the desk. I pulled it toward me. I fumbled with the lid. I deliberately typed my password incorrectly twice to simulate extreme cognitive distress. Heather hovered over my shoulder. Her breathing was jagged and loud. I successfully unlocked the machine. I did not open the banking portal. I minimized the main screen and accessed a deeply encrypted private security application. Heather demanded to know what I was doing. I mumbled incoherently about verifying the routing numbers. The screen turned black. A green digital map of the state slowly populated the monitor. Decades ago, I realized the immense danger of displaying vast wealth. I knew my children would eventually become targets for extortion or violent theft. I instituted a strict, unbreakable personal policy. I meticulously tracked every single high-value asset I purchased for my family. Every luxury vehicle, every imported sports car, and every piece of heavy jewelry contained a micro-GPS transmitter. I paid a private security firm in Geneva a massive annual retainer to embed these transmitters directly into the casings. I typed in the unique serial number corresponding to the platinum luxury watch I purchased for Jordan on his 30th birthday. It was a heavy, ostentatious timepiece he refused to take off. The security software pinged the satellite network. A bright red dot materialized on the green map. I zoomed in on the coordinates. The red dot was not moving. It was stationary at an industrial address located on the far west side of the city. I recognized the location instantly. It was an abandoned meatpacking plant resting on the edge of the river. The property was notorious among the local authorities. It hosted the largest, most exclusive underground casino operation in the entire state. The men running the floor were vicious. They catered strictly to high rollers who wanted to avoid federal tax scrutiny. I closed the laptop monitor with a sharp snap. I looked at Heather. I let tears well up in my eyes. I told her the digital transfer limits were strictly capped for my protection. I stated I could not move $50,000 online without triggering a mandatory federal hold. I explained the only way to secure the ransom money was to visit the main vault in person and authorize a physical cash withdrawal. Heather's eyes widened with greed. She nodded enthusiastically. She told me to hurry. She agreed to stay by the secure landline in the study to await further instructions from the kidnappers. I grabbed my trench coat from the brass coat rack. I shuffled slowly out of the study. I maintained my hunched posture until I reached the massive underground garage. I bypassed my collection of luxury sedans. I walked directly to a nondescript gray fleet vehicle parked in the corner. It was a standard corporate car used by my warehouse managers. It blended in perfectly with city traffic. I climbed into the driver's seat. I started the engine. I drove out of the estate gates and headed west. The drive took exactly 30 minutes. I navigated the crumbling streets of the industrial sector. The sleek glass towers of the financial district faded into rusted chain-link fences and cracked concrete. The heavy scent of the polluted river filled the cabin. This was my element. This was the exact type of neighborhood where I built my empire. I felt a surge of raw energy wash over me. The facade of the frail old man completely vanished. I parked the gray fleet vehicle 2 blocks away from the abandoned meatpacking plant. I walked the remaining distance through a dark, narrow alleyway. The heavy steel-reinforced door of the illegal casino was guarded by a massive man wearing a tactical vest. He stepped forward to block my path. He ordered me to turn around and walk away. I did not slow my pace. I reached into my coat pocket. I pulled out a thick stack of $100 bills bound by a rubber band. I slapped the money hard against the center of his chest. I told him I was a private investor looking for the VIP tables. I stared through him with absolute, unwavering authority. The guard hesitated for a fraction of a second. He looked at the money. He looked at my eyes. He stepped aside and pulled the heavy steel door open. I walked into the chaotic noise of the underground casino. The air was thick with cigar smoke and the harsh clatter of roulette wheels. I ignored the crowded main floor. I walked directly toward the back corridor lined with private soundproofed rooms. I checked my phone screen. The red dot pulsed brightly, isolating the exact room at the end of the hall. I stopped in front of a solid mahogany door marked with a gold star. I did not knock. I raised my heavy leather boot. I kicked the door directly beside the locking mechanism with every ounce of physical strength I possessed. The wood splintered violently. The door crashed inward and slammed against the interior wall. I stepped into the smoky VIP room. The air was perfectly still. 4 men sat around a green felt poker table covered in towering stacks of high-value casino chips. 2 of the men wore dark ski masks pushed up over their foreheads to drink their whiskey. They were the terrifying loan sharks from the photograph. Sitting directly between them was my son. Jordan was leaning back in a plush leather chair. The coarse ropes were pooled uselessly on the floor near his feet. He was holding a winning hand of cards. He was laughing uproariously. He was actively splitting a massive pile of chips with his kidnappers. He froze with a cigar halfway to his mouth. He stared at me in pure shock. I crossed my arms and smiled. Jordan dropped his cards onto the green felt table. The expensive cigar slipped from his fingers and landed on his pile of casino chips. A shower of gray ash scattered across the table. He stared at me with his mouth completely open. The color drained from his face entirely. He looked exactly like a cornered animal. The 2 men wearing dark ski masks tensed instantly. Their hands dropped below the edge of the table toward their concealed weapons. They were professionals. They recognized a hostile breach immediately. The 4th man at the table slowly pushed his chair back and stood up. He did not say a word. I stepped over the splintered remains of the heavy mahogany door. I kept my hands perfectly visible at my sides. I maintained a calm, steady breathing rhythm. I looked directly at Jordan. I did not raise my voice. I asked him if the $50,000 he demanded from his mother was intended to cover a losing hand, or if he was simply planning to pocket the cash for his next coastal mansion purchase. Jordan swallowed hard. He quickly recovered from the initial shock of seeing me standing in front of him. His fear morphed rapidly into defensive rage. He slammed his hands flat against the poker table. He stood up and pointed a trembling finger at my chest. He turned to the masked men and told them to ignore me. He loudly declared that I was just a senile, pathetic old man who had wandered out of his house. He stated I was suffering from severe cardiac trauma and advanced dementia. He claimed I had absolutely no idea where I was or what I was doing. Jordan pulled his cell phone from his tailored suit jacket. He held it up like a weapon. He told me he knew exactly what happened at the bank. He knew the manager had blocked the accounts. He sneered and stated the biometric lock was merely a temporary delay. He promised me the legal paperwork was already finalized. He threatened to call the local police precinct right that second. He stated he would tell the authorities I had suffered a violent psychiatric break. He promised to have me strapped to a medical gurney and permanently locked inside a secure psychiatric ward before the sun went down. He told me I would spend the rest of my miserable life heavily medicated and completely isolated. He laughed. He actually laughed in my face while threatening to erase my freedom. I did not argue with his diagnosis. I did not plead for my freedom. I reached inside the inner pocket of my heavy trench coat. The masked men flinched. They expected me to draw a firearm. I slowly pulled out a thick brown manila folder. I tossed it underhanded toward the center of the poker table. The folder landed with a heavy, authoritative slap. It slid across the smooth felt surface and knocked over Jordan's towering stack of casino chips. The plastic chips cascaded onto the floor with a loud clatter. The room fell completely silent. The men stared at the folder. I instructed the man sitting closest to the pile of chips to open it. I told him to look at the first page. The man hesitated. He glanced at his masked associates. He slowly reached out and flipped the cardboard cover open. He stared at the top document. His eyes widened significantly. I explained the contents of the folder with absolute clinical precision. I informed them that my corporate attorney possessed a very particular set of skills and highly placed contacts within the Federal Cyber Division. The folder contained high-definition photographs of their underground counting room. It contained printed screenshots of their encrypted offshore routing numbers. Most importantly, it contained a complete, exact copy of the casino's master digital ledger. The ledger detailed every single illegal sports bet, every money laundering transfer, and every violent extortion payment processed within this abandoned meatpacking plant over the past 36 months. The masked men stopped looking at Jordan. They locked their eyes entirely on me. I saw the pure, unadulterated panic setting into their rigid postures. They finally realized they were not dealing with a confused old man. They realized they were dealing with a man who had the power to dismantle their entire criminal enterprise with a single phone call. I delivered my ultimatum. I have never paid a single ransom in my entire life. I negotiated with ruthless transportation union bosses and organized crime syndicates decades before my son was even born. My philosophy on blackmail is absolute and completely uncompromising. You never pay the blackmailer. Paying a blackmailer simply funds their next inevitable demand. You find their leverage and you destroy it completely. You burn their leverage to the ground and you salt the earth so nothing can ever grow back. I offered the masked men two distinct choices. Option 1 involved me walking out of the room empty-handed. If I chose option 1, the digital files containing their entire illegal ledger would be transmitted directly to the regional director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation in exactly 60 seconds. I promised them federal raid teams would breach their reinforced doors before they could even pack their bags. They would lose their freedom, their money, and their lives. Option 2 required their immediate cooperation. I demanded they instantly erase every single dollar of debt Jordan currently owed them. I demanded the immediate confiscation of all the physical chips currently sitting on the poker table. Finally, I demanded they permanently blacklist my son from this establishment and every other affiliated underground operation in the entire state. If they ever allowed him to place another bet, the ledger would go to the authorities. The man holding the folder looked at the detailed financial records. He looked at the masked men. He gave a slow, definitive nod. The decision was made. The threat of federal prison completely overrode a minor gambling debt. One of the masked men stepped forward. He roughly shoved Jordan out of the way. He swept his massive forearms across the green felt table. He gathered every single casino chip into a large canvas bag. He zipped the bag shut. He looked directly at Jordan. He told my son his debt was officially cleared. He then told him he was dead to their organization. He stated clearly that if Jordan ever showed his face near this property again, they would break both of his legs and throw him into the polluted river. Jordan stood completely frozen. He stared at the empty poker table. His fake kidnapping plot was utterly dismantled. His massive pile of cash was gone. His leverage against me was destroyed. He was left standing in a broken room with absolutely zero financial backing. He turned to look at me. His arrogant facade had entirely collapsed. He opened his mouth to speak. He tried to formulate a new lie. He tried to offer an apology. I did not wait to hear his pathetic excuses. I had seen enough. I turned my back on my son. I walked out of the VIP room. I walked through the chaotic noise of the casino floor. I pushed open the heavy steel door and stepped back out into the cool, polluted night air. The industrial sector was quiet. I walked down the dark alleyway and climbed back into my gray fleet vehicle. I started the engine and drove away from the river. My chest ached fiercely. The physical toll of the last 24 hours was catching up to my body. I ignored the pain. I focused my mind entirely on the next tactical objective. Jordan was neutralized. His financial pipeline was severed. The immediate physical threat was removed. I needed to return to the estate to deal with Valerie and Bradley. They were still operating under the assumption that the forged medical certificate gave them absolute corporate authority. I knew they would not simply accept the bank manager's rejection. They would seek alternative avenues to liquidate my company. The drive back to the affluent suburbs took 40 minutes. I parked the gray fleet vehicle outside the main security gates of my estate. I did not want the tires to crunch on the gravel driveway and announce my arrival. I walked up the long, winding path toward the mansion. The exterior floodlights illuminated the manicured lawns and the towering oak trees. I expected the house to be dark and quiet. I expected Valerie to be nursing her defeat in her private quarters. I was entirely wrong. The grand driveway was packed with high-end luxury vehicles. They were not the sports cars favored by Valerie's country club friends. They were conservative, armored, executive sedans. They belonged to men and women who demanded absolute discretion and commanded massive salaries. I bypassed the side entrance. I walked directly up the wide marble steps to the grand front doors. The doors were unlocked. I pushed them open and stepped into the main foyer. A loud, authoritative voice echoed from the grand living room. I recognized the voice instantly. It belonged to the chief financial officer of my logistics empire. I walked silently down the hallway. I stopped at the edge of the arched doorway leading into the living room. Valerie had not retreated. She had escalated her attack. She had used the forged medical certificate to summon the entire corporate board of directors to my home in the middle of the night. 12 of the most powerful executives in the freight industry were standing in my living room. Valerie was pacing in front of the grand fireplace. She was holding the forged document high in the air. She was loudly demanding an emergency vote to permanently remove me as the chief executive officer. She was officially initiating a hostile corporate takeover right inside my own home. I stood in the shadows and watched the betrayal unfold. I stood in the darkened hallway. I listened to the shrill pitch of Valerie's voice echoing off the vaulted ceiling of my own living room. She paced aggressively in front of the massive stone fireplace. She waved the crumpled piece of paper in the air like a bloody sword. She painted a tragic, heartbreaking picture of my sudden decline. She told the 12 men and women sitting on my custom leather furniture that the massive heart attack had completely destroyed my cognitive function. She claimed I was currently locked in the master suite under heavy sedation. She insisted I was suffering from violent, uncontrollable delusions. She stated that my inability to lead was an immediate existential threat to the thousands of employees who relied on the freight empire for their livelihood. She was a phenomenal actress. She injected exactly the right amount of sorrow into her voice before pivoting sharply to cold corporate pragmatism. She demanded an emergency vote. She demanded the board invoke the medical incapacity clause of the company charter. She formally nominated Bradley to step in as the interim chief executive officer to guide the company through the transition. Bradley stood tall beside the fireplace. He wore a brand new tailored charcoal suit. He adjusted his silk tie and adopted an expression of solemn duty. He looked like a vulture waiting for the carcass to cool. The 12 members of the board of directors remained entirely silent. Valerie expected them to nod in agreement and rubber stamp her hostile takeover. She fundamentally misunderstood the people sitting in that room. She saw them merely as corporate executives in expensive Italian suits. I saw them for who they truly were. I looked at Marcus, sitting rigidly in the center armchair. 40 years ago, Marcus and I drove rusted flatbed trucks through blinding blizzards across the Rocky Mountains to deliver auto parts because we could not afford to lose a single contract. I looked at Sarah sitting near the window. She was our first dispatcher. She spent the entire decade of the 80s fighting corrupt union bosses over a crackling radio to keep our drivers safe. I looked at David, who personally rebuilt our broken engines when the banks refused to extend us a line of credit. These people did not inherit their wealth. They bled for it. They built the asphalt veins of this logistics network alongside me. Their loyalty belonged exclusively to the man who laid the foundation and shared the road, not the woman who simply spent the tolls. They looked at the forged medical certificate Valerie slapped onto the glass coffee table. They looked deeply uncomfortable. They respected the legal weight of the document, but their instincts told them something was horribly wrong. Marcus leaned forward. He rubbed his scarred chin. He told Valerie that permanently removing the founder of the company required more than a single piece of paper from a private concierge doctor no one had ever heard of. Valerie slammed her manicured hands onto the back of a chair. She raised her voice. She informed Marcus that the law did not require a second opinion. She stated the medical proxy was absolute and the board had a fiduciary duty to protect the shareholders from a madman. Bradley stepped forward to back her up. He told the board that delaying the vote would cause market panic. He insisted they needed to project strength and stability immediately. I decided they had spoken enough. I stepped out of the shadows of the hallway. I walked into the bright ambient light of the living room. I did not shuffle. I did not slump my shoulders. I stood perfectly straight. I smoothed the lapels of my heavy trench coat. I looked directly into Valerie's eyes. The color instantly drained from her face. She took a stumbling step backward and bumped into the stone hearth. Bradley's jaw dropped open. He looked as if he had just seen a dead man rise from the grave. The board members turned their heads in unison. Marcus immediately stood up. A massive smile broke across his weathered face. He did not see a senile, heavily sedated old man. He saw the exact same ruthless negotiator who had built an empire out of nothing. Valerie recovered her voice. She pointed a shaking finger at me. She shrieked at the board to look at me. She claimed my presence in the living room was absolute proof of my insanity. She yelled that I had escaped my medical confinement. She ordered Bradley to call the private security team to have me physically restrained and dragged back to my bed. She was doubling down on the lie because it was the only weapon she had left. I did not raise my voice to argue with her. Arguing with a hysterical liar validates their premise. I simply reached out and opened the heavy double doors leading to the front driveway. I stepped aside. A man walked into the living room. He did not look like the cheap, nervous hack Valerie and Bradley had smuggled into my bedroom earlier that morning. He was an older, distinguished gentleman. He wore a sharp navy suit and carried a thick, leather-bound medical dossier. I introduced him to the board of directors. He was Dr. Harrison Vance. He was the chief of cardiology and the head of the neurological trauma department at the state medical center. He was the exact physician who had successfully revived me and managed my care during my cardiac event. He was a man with an unimpeachable reputation and 4 decades of pristine medical practice. Dr. Vance walked directly to the glass coffee table. He did not even glance at Valerie. He unclasped his leather dossier. He spread a series of highly detailed, officially certified medical records across the glass. He addressed Marcus and the rest of the board with absolute clinical authority. He stated that he had personally conducted a comprehensive physiological and cognitive evaluation of my condition less than 48 hours ago. He presented time-stamped brain scans, detailed blood panel results, and a certified psychiatric clearance form. He declared unequivocally that my heart was recovering perfectly, and my mind was operating with crystalline precision. He formally stated that I was in perfect mental health and entirely capable of managing all personal and corporate affairs. I walked over to the coffee table. I picked up the forged certificate signed by the fake Dr. Aris. I held it up for the board to see. I calmly explained that my wife and my stepson had hired an unlicensed fraud to fabricate a medical diagnosis. I told them Valerie had attempted to use this forged document to illegally access the company's emergency reserves at the central bank earlier that morning. I explained that the entire hostile takeover was nothing more than a desperate, clumsy bank robbery disguised as corporate governance. The atmosphere in the room shifted instantly. The tension broke, replaced by a cold, unified anger directed entirely at Valerie and Bradley. Marcus looked at the forged paper in my hand. He looked at the certified brain scans presented by Dr. Vance. He turned his gaze toward Valerie. The grizzled veteran trucker did not hide his absolute disgust. He told Valerie that she had fundamentally miscalculated. He stated that the board of directors was not a collection of gullible puppets she could manipulate with a piece of counterfeit paper. Sarah stood up next. She crossed her arms over her chest. She looked Bradley up and down with pure contempt. She told him he would never possess the grit or the intelligence required to run the logistics empire. She stated that he was nothing more than a parasitic opportunist. One by one, every single member of the board of directors stood up. They did not take a vote. A vote was entirely unnecessary. They physically turned their backs on Valerie and Bradley. They walked over to me and shook my hand. The coup was officially crushed. The hostile takeover was dead on arrival. They had tried to steal my life's work, and they had failed in front of the most powerful people in the industry. Bradley panicked. He realized the corporate avenues were completely sealed. He realized his access to the company wealth was permanently terminated. He turned and sprinted toward the side door, abandoning his mother entirely to save his own skin. He pushed through the kitchen and bolted out the back exit into the night. Valerie remained standing by the fireplace. Her grand, luxurious empire had crumbled to dust in a matter of minutes. The bank accounts were locked. The corporate board had rejected her. Her proxy was worthless. I watched her eyes dart around the room. I watched her mind process the absolute totality of her defeat. A normal person would have surrendered. Valerie was not normal. Her greed was a bottomless void. She straightened her posture. She smoothed her designer skirt. The panic vanished from her eyes, replaced by a cold, venomous hatred. She realized she could not steal the company intact. She decided she would simply burn it to the ground. She looked directly at me. She announced that our marriage was completely over. She demanded an immediate mandatory division of all marital assets. She threatened to drag the logistics empire through a decade of brutal scorched earth divorce litigation. She swore she would financially bleed the company completely dry, bankrupt the corporate reserves, and destroy everything I had built unless I handed over half the empire in cash. Valerie did not lower her chin. She stood fiercely in front of the cold stone fireplace. She expanded on her threat with venomous precision. She promised to go directly to every major financial news outlet in the state. She swore to drag my name through the deepest mud imaginable. She detailed her upcoming media campaign. She would paint me as a paranoid, abusive tyrant who was rapidly losing his mind. She would publicly accuse the board of directors of covering up my severe cognitive decline to protect their own bloated salaries. She stated that the subsequent public relations nightmare would permanently destroy consumer confidence in the freight network. Our shipping partners would flee to our competitors. She smiled a razor-thin smile. She offered a single path to avoid total annihilation. She demanded I legally surrender exactly 50% of my corporate equity directly to her and her children before the sun came up. She wanted the immediate transfer of all voting rights associated with those shares. She believed she had successfully backed me into a corner. I remained standing near the arched doorway. I did not flinch at her extortion. I simply nodded toward the dark hallway behind me. Thomas Gallagher stepped into the bright light of the living room. Gallagher had served as the chief legal counsel for my logistics empire since the late 80s. He was a man composed entirely of sharp angles and ruthless legal pragmatism. He wore a simple tailored gray wool jacket. He carried a battered leather briefcase that held the secrets of 100 corporate wars. The board members shifted respectfully as he approached the glass coffee table. Valerie glared at him. She hated Gallagher. She had spent decades trying to convince me to replace him with a high-priced firm from the city. I never listened. Gallagher was the man who built the impenetrable legal walls around my company. Gallagher did not offer Valerie a greeting. He did not acknowledge her screaming threats. He calmly placed his heavy briefcase flat on the glass surface. He clicked the brass locks open. The sharp metallic sound echoed clearly in the silent room. He reached inside and withdrew a single thin manila folder. He opened the folder and extracted a document. The paper was visibly aged. The edges were slightly yellowed. He placed it carefully on the table directly in front of Valerie. He adjusted his reading glasses. He spoke with a quiet, devastating authority. He informed Valerie that her threats of a scorched earth divorce were completely hollow. He explained that a standard division of marital assets did not apply to this specific situation. He tapped his index finger against the top page of the yellowed document. He announced it was a post-nuptial agreement. It was heavily customized and completely ironclad. Gallagher recited the specific operative clause from memory. He stated that any deliberate attempt by a spouse to commit corporate fraud, manipulate company assets, or illegally seize executive control immediately and irrevocably forfeited all legal claims to alimony, spousal support, and equity division. He pointed out that Valerie's actions over the past 24 hours triggered this exact clause. Her documented attempt to use a forged medical certificate to drain the emergency cash reserves constituted severe corporate fraud. She had legally disinherited herself. Valerie stared at the yellowed paper. Her confident posture wavered. She recognized the thick black ink of her own signature resting on the bottom line. Her mind raced backward. She remembered exactly when she had signed that document. 2 decades ago, the national economy plunged into a brutal recession. My freight company was bleeding capital. I was fighting a desperate war to keep the business afloat and ensure the trucker pension fund remained fully solvent. My drivers relied on that fund for their survival, while I worked 80-hour weeks to save their pensions. Valerie focused entirely on her social standing. She desperately wanted a lifetime membership at the exclusive Fairfield Country Club to impress the local elites. I had explicitly forbidden the expense. She completely ignored my directive. She secretly accessed a secondary corporate account. She embezzled exactly $50,000 to secure her status among the wealthy housewives of the district. She believed the missing funds would go unnoticed in the chaos of the recession. I caught the discrepancy during a late-night audit. I traced the unauthorized wire transfer directly to the country club. I could have called the police. I could have had her arrested for corporate embezzlement. A public scandal would have ruined her life. I chose a different path. I forgave the theft to avoid tearing the family apart, but I demanded absolute permanent protection for my workers. I refused to let my drivers lose their retirement because of my wife's insatiable vanity. I instructed Gallagher to draft the post-nuptial agreement. I forced Valerie to sit in his office and sign it. She signed the document through angry tears. She signed it because she arrogantly believed I would never possess the coldness required to actually enforce it against her. She viewed my leniency as a permanent weakness. She had forgotten that a man who builds an empire never discards his weapons. He simply waits for the right moment to deploy them. Valerie looked up from the table. The reality of the situation crashed down upon her. The fake medical certificate was useless. The bank accounts were sealed. The board of directors had rejected her. Now the threat of a lucrative divorce settlement was entirely vaporized. She was completely stripped of all financial leverage. Her face twisted into a mask of pure unhinged fury. Her eyes burned with absolute hatred. She let out a guttural scream of frustration. She lunged forward across the glass table. She snatched the yellowed document directly out of Gallagher's hands. She gripped the paper tightly and ripped it straight down the middle. The sharp tearing sound ripped through the quiet room. She tore the pages again and again. She reduced the legal agreement to a handful of jagged, irregular scraps. She threw the shredded pieces violently onto the expensive Persian rug. She stood panting heavily. She pointed at the destroyed paper on the floor. She shrieked that the agreement was gone. She claimed I had zero proof of her signature. She declared she would still burn my empire to the ground in civil court. She believed she had just neutralized my final defense. Gallagher did not blink. He did not attempt to stop her from destroying the pages. He simply stood perfectly still and watched the scraps flutter to the floor. A slow, deeply satisfied smile spread across his face. He calmly reached into his tailored jacket pocket. He informed Valerie that she possessed a fundamental misunderstanding of basic legal procedures. He stated that a man who anticipates a hostile corporate war never brings his original ammunition to the battlefield. He told her she had just spent an incredible amount of energy shredding a high-quality photocopy. The original legally binding document bearing her wet ink signature rested safely inside a fireproof, climate-controlled vault in the basement of his downtown law firm. Valerie let out a sharp gasp. The breath completely left her lungs. She looked at the shredded paper on the rug and realized she had just made a total fool of herself in front of the entire corporate board. Her final desperate maneuver had accomplished absolutely nothing. She had nowhere left to run. She backed away from the coffee table. Her chest heaved with ragged, panicked breaths. She refused to accept total defeat. She refused to walk out of the mansion empty-handed. She reached into the pocket of her tailored jacket and pulled out her cell phone. She bypassed her standard contacts and opened a secure communication application. She summoned the heavy muscle. She contacted the private armed security detail she had personally hired that morning to lock down the estate. She screamed into the phone. She ordered the armed guards to breach the living room immediately. She ordered them to physically grab me by the throat and throw me out of the mansion. 4 armed private security contractors stepped out of the shadows of the mansion's grand foyer. They wore black tactical gear. They moved toward me with their hands resting heavily on the grips of their holstered weapons. Valerie stood safely behind them. She shrieked at the guards to remove me from the property immediately. She demanded they drag me out into the street. I raised my hand to stop their advance. I did not give them a single reason to use force. Violence is a messy, unpredictable tool utilized strictly by desperate people. I was not desperate. I adjusted the collar of my heavy trench coat. I looked at the shredded pieces of the counterfeit contract resting on the Persian rug. I looked at my wife's red, furious face. I turned my back on her and walked out the front doors. Gallagher walked silently beside me. We descended the marble steps. We walked down the long gravel driveway. I left the mansion exactly as I had built my logistics empire. I left it quietly, methodically, and completely under my own absolute control. I slept for 3 hours in a modest corporate hotel suite in the financial district. I woke up long before dawn. My mind was incredibly sharp. The dull ache in my chest was gone entirely. It was replaced by the cold, calculating adrenaline of total war. I drove the gray fleet vehicle back to the affluent suburbs as the sun began to rise. I pulled up to the massive wrought iron security gates of my estate. The digital keypad flashed a bright red error message. My entry codes were deleted. I looked through the thick iron bars. The manicured green front lawn was covered in black plastic trash bags. Several of the bags were violently ripped open. My tailored suits, my silk ties, and my handmade leather shoes were scattered indiscriminately across the damp morning grass. It was a pathetic, childish display of pure spite. Valerie wanted to humiliate me. She wanted the wealthy, gossiping neighbors to drive past the estate and see my personal belongings thrown out like common garbage. She wanted to project an image of absolute, uncontested dominance. Two private security contractors stood on the other side of the gate. They held automatic rifles strapped across their chests. They looked at me with bored, arrogant indifference. One of the men tapped the iron gate with the cold steel barrel of his weapon. He told me the property was officially locked down. He stated he had direct, explicit orders from the lady of the house to arrest me for trespassing if I attempted to scale the wall. He smiled a cruel, taunting smile. I looked at the armed guards. I looked at my ruined suits resting on the wet grass. A younger man would have lost his temper. A foolish man would have climbed the iron gate to fight for his pride and his property. I did not raise my voice. I did not argue with hired muscle. I did not demand to speak to my wife. I simply stared at the mansion I had paid for with 4 decades of grueling labor. I cataloged the exact position of the guards. I noted the specific damage to my property. I put the gray fleet vehicle in reverse. I drove away from the estate without saying a single word. True power does not require screaming threats through iron bars. True power requires a signature on the correct legal document. I drove directly to the municipal courthouse. The building was an imposing structure of gray stone and heavy concrete columns. Gallagher was already waiting for me on the front steps. He carried a fresh stack of perfectly organized manila folders. We walked through the metal detectors and bypassed the crowded public waiting rooms entirely. We headed straight for the County Property Records Division and the Civil Injunction Chambers. The court clerks recognized Gallagher immediately. He was a terrifying, legendary presence in these halls. We entered a private filing room. Gallagher placed the property deeds flat on the wooden table. Valerie believed the mansion was standard marital property. She believed she possessed a fundamental legal right to occupy the house simply because she was my wife. She believed a divorce filing granted her immediate residential immunity. She was completely oblivious to the financial architecture of my life. She spent her days at the country club blissfully ignorant of how her luxury was generated and protected. During the late 80s, the commercial logistics industry was an absolute minefield of predatory lawsuits. A single traffic accident involving a heavy freight truck could trigger massive personal liability claims. Plaintiff attorneys actively hunted successful business owners. They sought to pierce the corporate veil. They sought to seize personal homes, private bank accounts, and family college funds to settle exorbitant corporate disputes. I refused to leave my family vulnerable to an opportunistic lawsuit. I meticulously structured my entire empire to completely shield my assets from external seizure. I built an impenetrable corporate fortress. The Fairfield estate was never registered in my personal name. It was never registered in Valerie's name. The land, the mansion, the sprawling gardens, and every single piece of custom furniture inside the house were legally classified as primary corporate assets. The estate belonged entirely to the freight company. It served on paper as a designated executive retreat and a commercial hosting facility. My residence there was strictly a benefit of my position as the chief executive officer. I held the unchallengeable title of CEO. Valerie was legally classified as an authorized guest of the corporation. Her brazen attempt to launch a hostile takeover combined with her violent demand for an immediate divorce completely severed her authorization. She was no longer a welcomed guest. She was a hostile entity illegally occupying a commercial asset. Furthermore, she had actively hired armed mercenaries to block the legitimate CEO from accessing company property. Gallagher swiftly filed a commercial eviction notice. He bypassed the lengthy, agonizing delays of a standard residential divorce dispute. Residential evictions can take agonizing months of mediation. Commercial evictions are brutal, lightning fast, and completely merciless. They are specifically designed by the courts to protect businesses from immediate financial harm and hostile occupation. The presiding judge reviewed the corporate deeds. He reviewed the post-nuptial agreement confirming Valerie had legally forfeited all equity claims by committing fraud. He reviewed the sworn affidavits regarding the armed guards blocking a corporate facility. The judge stamped the commercial eviction order with a heavy definitive strike of his gavel. It was exactly 2 o'clock in the afternoon. The sun was shining brightly over the affluent suburbs. Valerie sat on the expansive stone patio of the estate. She drank expensive champagne from a crystal flute. She admired the armed guards securing her perimeter. She felt entirely untouchable. She believed she had won the geographical war. The sound of heavy tires crunching aggressively on the gravel driveway shattered her peace. 3 county sheriff cruisers pulled up directly to the wrought iron gates. The flashing red and blue lights reflected blindingly off the metal bars. The private security guards immediately lowered their weapons and stepped rapidly backward. Mercenaries do not fight sworn law enforcement officers over a paycheck. The county sheriff stepped out of his lead vehicle. He wore a crisp brown uniform and a wide-brimmed hat. He walked straight through the open gates. He completely ignored the scattered designer clothing rotting on the lawn. He marched directly up the stone steps to the patio. Valerie stood up. Her champagne flute trembled in her hand. She demanded to know why he was trespassing on her private property. She loudly ordered him to arrest me. The sheriff did not listen to her arrogant demands. He pulled a folded yellow legal document from his utility belt. He handed it directly to her. He informed her that the property was a registered corporate asset. He stated clearly that she was currently engaged in unlawful commercial trespassing. He delivered a mandatory 30-day eviction notice. He told her she had exactly 1 month to entirely vacate the premises before his armed deputies returned to physically throw her and her remaining belongings directly into the street. Valerie watched the taillights of the sheriff cruisers disappear down the long gravel driveway. The 30-day eviction notice felt like a physical weight in her hands. She turned around and looked at the sprawling mansion. The realization hit her with absolute clarity. She was entirely out of legal maneuvers. The post-nuptial agreement nullified her financial claims. The biometric locks sealed the bank accounts. The commercial eviction notice stripped her of her residential sanctuary. She walked back inside the grand foyer. She locked the heavy oak doors. She paced the marble floor. Her mind worked frantically to manufacture a new reality. She knew that a standard civil dispute would not save her. She needed a criminal charge. She needed an immediate violent accusation that would force the state to arrest me and grant her an emergency protective order. A protective order would grant her exclusive occupancy of the residence and completely override a commercial eviction. She walked to the ornate gilded mirror hanging in the hallway. She stared at her own reflection. She took a deep breath. She raised her manicured hands to her face. She curled her fingers inward and dragged her sharp acrylic nails forcefully down her own cheek. She did not stop there. She clawed at her neck and tore the fabric of her expensive silk blouse. She struck her own shoulder against the edge of the mahogany console table to produce a dark, visible bruise. She physically destroyed her immaculate appearance to construct a scene of brutal domestic violence. She picked up her cell phone and dialed the emergency dispatch line. She forced her breathing to become rapid and shallow. When the operator answered, Valerie unleashed a masterclass in theatrical terror. She shrieked into the receiver. She claimed I had bypassed the security gates, kicked down the back door, and violently assaulted her in a fit of rage. She begged the police to hurry, stating she feared for her very life. I was completely unaware of her bloody performance. I was standing on the concrete floor of my primary logistics warehouse located on the industrial outskirts of the city. The air was thick with the scent of diesel fuel, hot rubber, and burning asphalt. Towering steel racks held thousands of tons of commercial cargo. Forklifts beeped continuously as they loaded pallets onto idling semi-trucks. I watched the mechanical rhythm of my empire with deep satisfaction. This was the beating heart of my wealth. This was a world built on iron sweat and undeniable truth. There was no room for manipulation on the loading dock. A pallet weighed exactly what the scale dictated. A delivery arrived exactly when the clock demanded. It was a perfect, honest machine. The heavy bay doors at the far end of the warehouse suddenly rolled open. 2 county police cruisers drove directly onto the loading floor. Their tires squealed against the polished concrete. The flashing red and blue lights cast harsh, strobing shadows across the stacks of cargo. The warehouse workers stopped their machines. A heavy, anxious silence fell over the massive facility. 4 uniformed officers stepped out of the vehicles. They unclipped the retention straps on their holsters. They scanned the floor until they found me standing near the dispatch office. They marched toward me with aggressive, purposeful strides. They did not see a respected corporate executive. They saw a violent domestic abuser based entirely on a fabricated phone call. I did not retreat. I did not raise my hands in panic. I stood my ground and waited for them to approach. The lead officer stopped 3 feet away from me. He placed his hand squarely on the grip of his firearm. He demanded my full name. He loudly informed me that I was being placed under immediate arrest for aggravated home invasion and felony domestic battery. He stated that my wife was currently receiving medical attention for severe lacerations and bruising. He pulled a pair of steel handcuffs from his belt and ordered me to turn around and place my hands behind my back. I looked at the steel cuffs. I looked at the tense, angry faces of the officers. I asked the lead officer a single calm question. I asked him to provide the exact specific time the alleged assault occurred. He glared at me. He barked that the emergency call was placed exactly 45 minutes ago, and the victim claimed the attack happened immediately prior to the call. I nodded slowly. I gestured toward the glass-enclosed dispatch office situated 10 yards away. I invited the officers to step inside the office before they made a permanent career-ending mistake. I told them I possessed absolute incontrovertible proof that their victim was a dangerous liar. The lead officer hesitated. He looked at his partner. He reluctantly agreed to view the evidence, warning me that any sudden movements would result in immediate force. We walked into the quiet dispatch office. I sat down behind the main security terminal. I booted up the central surveillance system. I pulled up the high-definition camera feeds covering the exterior and interior of the warehouse. I entered the exact time code the officer provided. The screen displayed crystal-clear footage. It showed me standing on the loading dock speaking with my shift managers, reviewing cargo manifests and physically inspecting freight. The footage covered the entire hour surrounding the alleged assault. I was never off camera for more than 30 seconds. I did not stop there. I opened a secondary application on the monitor. I accessed the GPS tracking log embedded inside the gray fleet vehicle parked outside. The digital map displayed the car's exact movement history for the past 24 hours. It proved the vehicle had arrived at the warehouse early in the morning and had not moved a single inch since. I had the technological equivalent of an airtight alibi. The officers stared at the screens. The aggression slowly drained from their postures. The lead officer crossed his arms. He admitted the footage was compelling, but he argued that digital systems could be manipulated or pre-recorded by a sophisticated tech team. He demanded a physical witness to corroborate my location during the time frame in question. I leaned back in my chair. I delivered the final devastating piece of reality. I told the officers that I did not spend my entire morning on the loading dock. I explained that exactly 45 minutes ago, during the precise window of the fabricated attack, I was sitting in the private dining room of a downtown steakhouse located 4 blocks away from the warehouse. I was eating an early lunch with a very specific, highly credible witness. I told the officers I was breaking bread with the chief of police. I let that information hang in the air. The officers froze. Decades ago, I recognized that law enforcement officers worked brutal hours for minimal compensation. When the city faced a severe budget crisis and threatened to slash the police department's pension fund, I stepped in silently. I became the primary anonymous benefactor of their retirement accounts. I poured millions of dollars into their union trust to guarantee that every officer who risked their life would retire with dignity. I never asked for favors. I never asked to be exempted from the law. I simply supported the men and women who held the line. The chief of police knew exactly who funded his department's future. We met once a month to review the trust. Today happened to be our scheduled meeting. I instructed the lead officer to pick up his radio. I told him to call the chief directly on his secure channel. I told him to ask his commanding officer exactly who he was eating steak with 45 minutes ago. The lead officer swallowed hard. He stepped out of the dispatch office. He unclipped his radio microphone and made the call. He spoke in hushed, urgent tones. He listened intently for a full minute. When he walked back into the office, his face was entirely pale. He looked at me with a mixture of profound embarrassment and deep respect. He apologized profusely. He confirmed the chief had personally verified my exact location and corroborated my alibi down to the minute. The entire domestic assault accusation was mathematically, physically, and logically impossible. Valerie had crafted a desperate lie that completely imploded upon impact with reality. The officers holstered their cuffs. They realized they had been manipulated by a vindictive spouse trying to weaponize the police force for a civil dispute. The lead officer keyed his radio again. He dispatched a separate unit directly back to the mansion. He did not send them to offer Valerie protection. He sent them to deliver a severe, unforgiving criminal warning. When the patrol car pulled up to the estate, the officers found Valerie sitting in the foyer with a bandaged arm waiting to play the victim. They did not offer her sympathy. They stood in her doorway and informed her that her lie was completely exposed. They told her she was officially on notice for filing a false police report and wasting emergency municipal resources. They promised her that one more fabricated call would result in her immediate arrest and incarceration. They turned their backs and left her standing in the doorway, utterly humiliated and stripped of her last desperate weapon. Valerie realized the police would no longer respond to her cries. She realized the legal system was entirely closed to her manipulation. She had failed to steal the company, she had failed to block the eviction, and she had failed to frame me for a violent crime. The walls of her pristine, wealthy life were rapidly closing in. But she was not fighting this war alone. Alicia had been standing on the sweeping staircase, observing the entire interaction with the police. She watched her mother receive the criminal warning. She realized the traditional avenues of power were completely controlled by my foresight. She decided to bypass the law entirely and appealed directly to the court of public opinion. Alicia possessed a massive dedicated following on multiple social media platforms. She cultivated an image of a wealthy, empathetic influencer. She knew exactly how to manipulate an audience with perfectly timed tears and fabricated outrage. Alicia pulled her smartphone from her pocket. She marched down the stairs and stood next to her mother. She deliberately messed up her own hair to look frantic. She hit the live broadcast button on her primary social media account. She waited until the viewer count spiked into the tens of thousands. She stared directly into the camera lens and began to sob. She recorded Valerie's scratched face and torn clothing. She wailed into the microphone. She told her massive audience that they were currently trapped inside a nightmare. She completely inverted the narrative. She claimed that I was a corrupt, abusive tyrant who had violently assaulted her mother. She cried that I was using my vast corporate wealth to actively buy off the police department and silence their cries for help. She painted a picture of a desperate family held hostage by a powerful monster who controlled the entire city. She begged her followers to share the video and expose the systemic corruption protecting me. She weaponized her digital platform to launch a devastating global smear campaign designed to destroy my public reputation and bring the logistics empire to its knees. Alicia's tear-streaked face dominated every digital screen in the state within 2 hours. Her fabricated narrative spread with the speed of a wildfire fueled by an algorithmic thirst for scandal. She expertly manipulated the public's inherent distrust of corporate wealth. She framed my strategic foresight as systemic corruption. She accused the police department of operating as my personal security force. The comments section beneath her broadcast turned into a toxic avalanche of death threats, boycott demands, and calls for my immediate resignation. The digital mob did not care about the truth. They only cared about the spectacle. The fallout was instantaneous. The phones inside the central dispatch office began ringing in a chaotic, unending chorus. My regional managers stood by their terminals with pale faces. They fielded panicked calls from our shipping partners. 3 mid-level clients suspended their freight contracts before noon. They cited the morality clauses in our service agreements. They refused to associate their brands with an alleged domestic abuser who bought off municipal authorities. The public relations crisis threatened to paralyze the entire logistics network. The loading dock, usually a symphony of organized mechanical movement, ground to a tense, uncertain halt. Bradley watched the digital carnage unfold from the safety of his luxury downtown apartment. He did not care about his mother's scratched face or his sister's hysterical broadcast. He only saw a massive golden opportunity. He knew the company was bleeding consumer confidence. He moved with the predatory speed of a corporate scavenger. He had secretly established a shell logistics company 3 months prior, operating under a blind trust. He immediately contacted the chief supply officer of Apex Manufacturing. Apex was our cornerstone client. They represented 30% of my entire annual revenue. Bradley pitched his shell company as a pristine, scandal-free alternative. He promised to honor my exact pricing structure while completely shielding Apex from the toxic media circus surrounding my name. He believed the timing was absolutely perfect. He believed he was executing a masterful corporate coup in the shadow of his sister's fabricated drama. My executive team urged me to retreat. Gallagher advised me to issue a carefully crafted, legally sanitized press release. My communications director drafted a hollow corporate apology designed to appease the digital mob. I took the printed apology from his hands and tore it perfectly in half. I dropped the pieces into a metal trash can. I refused to apologize for crimes I did not commit. I refused to negotiate with digital extortionists. I built my entire reputation in the freight industry on a foundation of absolute transparency and raw, unfiltered honesty. My clients trusted me because I never hid my failures, and I never sugarcoated the harsh realities of the supply chain. I decided to handle the media the exact same way I handled corrupt union bosses and hostile competitors. I decided to hit them with the undisputed truth. I ordered my warehouse managers to clear the center lane of the primary loading floor. I instructed them to park two massive idling semi-trucks on either side of the floor to serve as a backdrop. I did not want a sterile corporate boardroom. I wanted the smell of diesel fuel and the grit of the concrete floor. I instructed my team to invite every major local news affiliate and every national correspondent currently parked outside the gates. The press eagerly swarmed into the warehouse. They expected a broken, defensive billionaire. They expected a man terrified by the allegations of a crying social media influencer. They set up their tripods and aimed dozens of heavy lenses directly at the simple wooden podium I had placed in the center of the floor. I stepped up to the microphone. The rapid flashing of camera shutters illuminated the dark warehouse. I did not wear a tailored suit. I wore my heavy work boots and my standard trench coat. I looked directly into the bank of television cameras. I did not offer a polite greeting. I stated clearly that my estranged wife and her daughter were currently engaged in a massive coordinated campaign of criminal defamation. I informed the press that Alicia's viral broadcast was a deliberate, calculated lie designed to extort me for corporate equity. The journalists began shouting questions. They demanded to know about the alleged assault. They demanded to know why the police had refused to arrest me. I raised my hand and commanded absolute silence. I told them I would not debate the character of my family. I would simply provide the empirical evidence of their true nature. I pulled a small digital audio player from my coat pocket. I connected it directly to the warehouse public address system. I informed the media that they were about to hear an official subpoenaed recording from the County Emergency Dispatch Center. I explained that this recording captured a phone call placed by the paramedics on the exact night I suffered my massive cardiac event. The paramedics were attempting to contact my primary residential proxy to authorize emergency surgical procedures while I was completely unconscious in the back of the ambulance. I pressed the play button. The audio hissed over the massive warehouse speakers. The voice of the emergency dispatcher echoed through the cavernous space. The dispatcher urgently informed the recipient that her husband was suffering a catastrophic heart attack and required immediate family consent for an experimental life-saving bypass. The next voice on this recording belonged entirely to Valerie. It was not the voice of a panicked, grieving wife. It was the cold, annoyed tone of a woman inconvenienced by an unwanted phone call. Her words were sharp, clear, and absolutely devastating. She told the dispatcher to stop calling. She stated with venomous clarity not to call until 8 o'clock in the morning because she was currently hosting a private party. She then explicitly instructed the dispatcher to let the doctors do whatever they wanted, adding that if I died, they should simply forward the death certificate to her lawyer. The sharp click of the disconnected line echoed loudly. I stopped the audio player. The warehouse fell into a profound, suffocating silence. The journalists stopped taking photographs. The reporters stared at me with wide, shocked eyes. The raw cruelty of the recording completely obliterated the victim narrative Alicia had so carefully constructed. No one could defend a woman who had casually abandoned her husband to die in an ambulance because she did not want to interrupt her social gathering. I leaned into the microphone. I stated that a woman capable of leaving her husband to die for the sake of a cocktail party is fully capable of scratching her own face to steal a logistics empire. I thanked the press for their time and walked away from the podium. I did not answer a single question. I left the empirical truth hanging heavily in the air. The public shift was immediate and absolutely brutal. The news networks instantly pivoted their coverage. They broadcasted the emergency dispatch recording on a continuous, inescapable loop. The digital mob that had called for my destruction suddenly turned their collective rage entirely onto Valerie and Alicia. The internet branded them as sociopathic monsters. Their social media accounts were flooded with immense backlash, forcing Alicia to deactivate her profiles and retreat into total digital isolation. The corporate fallout was equally decisive. The chief supply officer of Apex Manufacturing watched the press conference live from his executive office. He recognized the undeniable proof of my integrity. He immediately called my private cellular line. He apologized for doubting my leadership. He explicitly confirmed that Apex would renew our freight contract for the next 5 years. He then sent a harsh, globally visible corporate memo permanently blacklisting Bradley and his newly formed shell company from ever bidding on an Apex contract. Bradley's grand corporate coup collapsed before it even began. His investors vanished. His credibility in the financial sector was instantly pulverized. He realized he was permanently exiled from the logistics industry. He stormed out of his luxury apartment building in a state of blind, frantic rage. He needed someone to blame. He needed a target for his absolute failure. He stomped across the executive parking lot toward his vehicle. He spotted Jordan leaning against the hood of a sleek sports car. Jordan was smoking a cigarette, looking nervous and deeply indebted. Bradley marched aggressively toward him, clenching his fists, fully prepared to unleash his fury on his gambling-addicted stepbrother. Bradley closed the distance across the asphalt with heavy, aggressive strides. His tailored charcoal suit jacket flared out behind him. His face was flushed with the toxic combination of total corporate humiliation and adrenaline. Jordan remained leaning against the hood of his bright red sports car. He took a long drag from his cigarette and exhaled a plume of gray smoke into the cool morning air. He noticed Bradley approaching. He pushed himself off the hood of the car. He dropped the cigarette onto the pavement and ground it out beneath the heel of his Italian loafer. He attempted to project an aura of casual indifference. His trembling hands entirely betrayed his manufactured confidence. Bradley did not slow down. He did not issue a verbal warning. He crossed the final few feet and violently shoved Jordan with both hands. The impact slammed Jordan backward against the side panel of his own vehicle. The heavy thud of bone hitting metal echoed across the empty section of the executive parking lot. Jordan gasped for air. He instinctively raised his hands to protect his face. Bradley grabbed him by the lapels of his silk shirt. He pinned him against the door. Bradley screamed into Jordan's face. He blamed his stepbrother for the total collapse of their unified front. He accused Jordan of catastrophic stupidity. He explicitly cited Jordan's amateur blackmail attempt at the underground casino. He stated that Jordan's reckless gambling debts had forced my hand. He claimed that if Jordan had simply maintained a low profile, the medical incapacity clause would have functioned perfectly. The board of directors would have voted me out before the end of the week. Bradley yelled that his shell company was instantly pulverized because Jordan lacked the basic discipline to keep his vices hidden from the men who ran the city. Jordan did not accept the blame. He shoved his forearms hard against Bradley's chest and broke the physical hold. He pushed Bradley backward. He wiped a streak of saliva from his cheek. He sneered at his older stepbrother. Jordan accused Bradley of spectacular hypocrisy. He stated that the grand corporate coup was always a secondary objective. He claimed he knew exactly what Bradley had done during the chaos of the mansion lockdown. Jordan accused Bradley of slipping into the private executive study while Valerie was orchestrating the fake medical exam. He accused him of opening the hidden wall safe and completely emptying the emergency cash reserves. Jordan screamed that Bradley was nothing more than a common thief, masquerading as a legitimate corporate successor. The accusation struck a raw nerve. Bradley's eyes widened with genuine uncontrollable fury. He swung his right fist in a wild, uncalculated arc. The blow connected solidly with the side of Jordan's jaw. Jordan's head snapped sharply to the left. A bright spray of blood flew from his split lip and stained the polished red paint of the sports car door. Jordan stumbled sideways. He lost his footing and dropped to one knee on the rough asphalt. The fragile alliance between the two men completely shattered. Their entire bond was forged exclusively in the shadow of Valerie's relentless ambition. They were united only by the promise of unearned wealth and the shared goal of plundering my logistics empire. The absolute moment the money disappeared, the familial ties evaporated. They were not brothers protecting a shared legacy. They were starving scavengers fighting over a barren carcass. Jordan wiped the blood from his mouth. He looked at his ruined designer shirt. A feral rage overtook him. He lunged upward from the pavement. He drove his shoulder directly into Bradley's midsection. The tackle carried both men backward. They crashed heavily onto the hard concrete of the parking lot. They rolled across the abrasive surface. Bradley threw desperate, frantic punches. Jordan scrambled on top of him. He delivered a sickening blow directly to the center of Bradley's face. The distinct sound of breaking cartilage echoed in the air. Bradley screamed in agony. He bucked his hips and flipped Jordan off his chest. I stood silently behind the reinforced glass window of my second-floor executive office. I held a ceramic mug of black coffee. I watched the violent spectacle unfolding 50 yards below me. I did not feel an ounce of pity. I simply observed the mathematical outcome of a life built entirely on greed. Valerie had spent 30 years teaching her children to relentlessly covet the prize. She had never spent a single day teaching them how to build the foundation. When the prize was finally ripped away from them, they possessed absolutely no internal structure to keep themselves from collapsing into primal violence. The heavy wooden door of my office opened. Mike, my primary warehouse security supervisor, stepped into the room. He wore a high-visibility vest over his tactical uniform. He held a two-way radio in his left hand. He looked out the window at the two men destroying each other on the pavement. He turned to me and asked for authorization to deploy the physical intervention team. He stated that his guards could separate the combatants and escort them off the commercial property within 60 seconds. I took a slow sip of my coffee. I shook my head. I explicitly ordered Mike to stand his men down. I told him to keep the security perimeter strictly maintained around the active loading bays. I instructed him to let the two men fight. Intervening would only redirect their shared anger back toward the company. Allowing them to physically dismantle each other was the most efficient method of neutralizing their residual threat. They were doing my work for me. Down in the parking lot, the fight escalated into a brutal display of pure exhaustion. Neither man had ever engaged in a genuine physical altercation. Their punches grew slow and heavy. Their breathing became ragged and desperate. Bradley managed to climb to his feet. His designer suit was torn at the shoulder. Blood poured steadily from his broken nose and stained his white collar. Jordan remained on the ground, leaning heavily against the front tire of a parked vehicle. He was clutching his ribs and gasping for oxygen. Bradley looked around the parking lot. His vision was clouded by pain and absolute humiliation. He spotted a yellow maintenance cart parked near the edge of the active loading zone. A mechanic had left a heavy solid steel lug wrench resting on the top shelf. Bradley stumbled toward the cart. He grabbed the cold metal tool. He gripped it with both hands. He turned back toward Jordan. He intended to finish the fight with a weapon. Jordan saw the steel wrench. He realized the extreme danger of the situation. He scrambled frantically backward on his hands and knees. He tried to put distance between himself and his enraged stepbrother. Bradley raised the heavy tool above his head. He let out a guttural, terrifying roar. He swung the wrench downward with every ounce of remaining strength in his body. He missed Jordan entirely. The momentum of the swing carried Bradley forward. The heavy steel lug wrench smashed directly into the front windshield of a brand-new $500,000 Freightliner delivery cab parked in the staging lane. The impact was deafening. The reinforced safety glass spiderwebbed instantly into 1,000 jagged fractures. A massive hole opened in the center of the window. The alarm system of the truck immediately triggered. The deafening siren wailed across the industrial complex. Bradley froze. The heavy wrench slipped from his bloody hands and clattered onto the concrete. He stared at the destroyed windshield. He slowly realized the catastrophic magnitude of his error. He had crossed the definitive line between a personal dispute and a major corporate felony. I turned away from the window. I walked back to my large mahogany desk. I picked up the receiver of my secure landline. I dialed the direct emergency dispatch number for the local police precinct. I calmly identified myself. I reported a violent physical altercation and a severe incident of intentional property damage currently in progress at my primary commercial facility. I requested immediate law enforcement intervention. The response was overwhelming. The officers who had previously responded to Valerie's fabricated assault claim were already patrolling the industrial sector. They harbored a deep resentment toward the family that had attempted to weaponize their badges. 3 patrol cruisers breached the warehouse gates within exactly 4 minutes. They completely surrounded the staging lane. The officers drew their weapons and ordered both men to the ground. Bradley and Jordan were entirely too exhausted to resist. They dropped to their knees on the abrasive concrete. The officers secured their wrists with heavy steel handcuffs. They roughly hauled them to their feet and shoved them into the back of the reinforced police cruisers. They were formally arrested for felony destruction of commercial property and severe public affray. The news of the arrest traveled with lightning speed. The booking officer at the precinct officially processed their charges and set the mandatory bail requirements. The phone rang inside the grand foyer of a luxury condominium on the other side of the city. Heather answered the call. She listened to the panicked voice of her husband calling from a holding cell. She dropped the phone. She grabbed her keys and rushed directly to the Central Police Precinct. Heather arrived at the sterile, fluorescent-lit booking desk. She demanded the immediate release of her husband. The desk sergeant informed her that the combined bail for both men exceeded $100,000 in liquid cash. Heather stared at the officer in absolute terror. Bradley's accounts were frozen by the corporate fallout. Jordan's assets were entirely consumed by his casino debts. Heather possessed no independent wealth. She realized there was only one person left in the entire state who could prevent them from spending the weekend in a violent county jail. She picked up her phone. She dialed Valerie's number. She forced her mother-in-law to drain the absolute last remaining drops of her hidden personal cash reserves to pay the exorbitant bond. Valerie pushed through the heavy glass doors of the Central Police Precinct. She wore a pristine white designer coat that stood in stark, glaring contrast to the grim reality of the building. The air inside the precinct smelled of stale coffee floor wax and human desperation. She hated this environment. She despised being forced to step into a municipal building filled with common criminals and overworked civil servants. She viewed the entire situation as a deeply offensive inconvenience. Heather sat rigidly on a cracked wooden bench near the holding cells. She stood up immediately when Valerie entered the lobby. Heather's face was streaked with running makeup. She began to rapidly explain the catastrophic situation regarding Bradley and Jordan. She detailed the felony charges. She explained the massive property damage to the commercial delivery truck. She panicked over the possibility of her husband spending the entire weekend locked inside a violent county jail. Valerie held up a single manicured hand to silence her daughter-in-law. She did not want to hear the pathetic details of a parking lot fistfight. She only cared about optics and control. She believed that every single problem in the world possessed a specific price tag. She operated under the absolute conviction that her immense wealth granted her total immunity from the consequences of the law. She marched directly up to the high plexiglass counter of the booking desk. She did not wait in line. She bypassed two other families entirely. She tapped her heavy diamond ring aggressively against the glass to command the immediate attention of the desk sergeant. The desk sergeant was a heavily built man with tired eyes and a graying mustache. He slowly looked up from his computer terminal. He did not care about her designer coat or her expensive jewelry. He asked her for the names of the suspects. Valerie stated the names with sharp, clipped arrogance. She demanded the immediate release of Bradley and Jordan. She ordered the officer to produce the bail paperwork so she could finalize the transaction and leave the disgusting building. The sergeant typed the names into his keyboard. He read the screen with total bureaucratic indifference. He informed Valerie that the combined bail for the felony property destruction and public affray charges was set at exactly $100,000. He stated that the precinct required the full amount processed immediately to secure their release before the midnight transfer to the county penitentiary. Valerie did not flinch at the massive figure. She unclasped her luxury handbag. For 2 entire decades, Valerie had not touched a single paper bill. She viewed physical cash as a filthy, outdated relic utilized exclusively by the working class. Her entire existence was funded and maintained by premium corporate plastic. Her credit cards were the magic wands that constructed her reality. She pulled a heavy, solid metal black platinum card from her leather wallet. She slid it confidently under the plexiglass partition. She told the officer to run the card and process the release forms. The desk sergeant picked up the heavy metal card. He swiped it through the precinct's payment terminal. The machine processed the information for 3 seconds. The terminal emitted a sharp, loud electronic beep. The screen flashed a bright red error message. The officer slid the card back across the counter. He informed her the transaction was completely declined by the issuing institution. Valerie stared at the card resting on the scratched counter. A deep, unfamiliar knot of anxiety formed in her stomach. She immediately went on the offensive. She refused to accept a financial rejection. She loudly accused the officer of operating a broken, outdated municipal machine. She claimed her platinum account possessed an unlimited daily spending threshold. She demanded he wipe the magnetic strip and process the transaction a second time. The sergeant did not argue. He swiped the black card again. The machine emitted the exact same sharp denial tone. He shook his head. He told her the bank was explicitly blocking the transfer of funds. Valerie felt a cold sweat form on the back of her neck. Heather stood a few feet away watching the exchange with mounting horror. Valerie opened her wallet again. She pulled out a secondary private wealth management card. It was a card tied directly to her personal elite banking portfolio. She shoved it under the glass. She ordered the officer to run the secondary account. She insisted there was a massive surplus of liquid capital readily available. The officer swiped the second card. The machine processed the data. The red light flashed instantly. The transaction was denied. Valerie lost her composure. Her voice escalated into a shrill, demanding shriek. She yelled at the desk sergeant. She claimed the police department was deliberately holding her family hostage. She accused them of systemic incompetence. She dug frantically into her wallet. She bypassed her personal cards entirely. She pulled out her ultimate financial safety net. It was a diamond-tier corporate expense card tied directly to the primary operational accounts of the freight empire. It was a card designed to purchase commercial warehouses and fleet vehicles. She threw it at the officer. She ordered him to charge the corporate line. The desk sergeant picked up the corporate card. He inserted the chip directly into the terminal reader. The machine did not beep immediately. The screen locked onto a processing screen for 10 agonizing seconds. Finally, the terminal emitted a long, continuous, solid tone. The machine did not return the card. The automated locking mechanism clamped down on the plastic. Valerie reached under the glass to grab her card. The officer placed his hand over the terminal. He looked directly at the detailed alert flashing across his monitor. He looked back at Valerie. He informed her that the machine had officially swallowed the card. He stated he was legally obligated to retain the plastic. Valerie pounded her fists against the plexiglass. She demanded her property back. She threatened to call the mayor. The desk sergeant turned his monitor slightly so she could see the glowing text on the screen. He explained the situation with brutal, unforgiving clarity. He told her that a federal mandate had just triggered across the entire banking network. The federal authorities had initiated a comprehensive total freeze on every single joint account, personal line of credit, and corporate expense portfolio associated with her name and social security number. The officer continued reading the legal alert. He informed her that the freeze was the direct result of a massive active fraud investigation. The authorities were actively investigating the creation and utilization of forged medical documents to illegally access corporate emergency reserves. Furthermore, the banking system indicated that the primary account holder had legally and permanently severed her access to all financial lines exactly 5 days ago. The money she arrogantly believed she possessed was entirely an illusion. Her wealth was vaporized. She was standing inside a gritty municipal police station with zero liquid capital, zero credit, and zero leverage. Valerie stood frozen at the counter. The reality of her total destruction finally pierced her armor. She had no money to pay the bail. She had no money to hire a private defense attorney. She could not even afford a taxi ride back to the affluent suburbs. She snatched her purse from the counter. She turned and sprinted blindly toward the exit. She burst through the heavy glass doors and stumbled out into the cool night air. Heather chased desperately after her. Valerie stood on the concrete steps of the precinct. She pulled her cell phone from her pocket with shaking hands. She dialed my private direct line. She listened to the phone ring. When the line finally connected, she lost her mind entirely. She screamed into the receiver. She hurled every vicious insult she could formulate. She demanded that I immediately call the bank and lift the federal holds. She ordered me to transfer the bail money to the precinct. She threatened to ruin my life if I left her son in a jail cell. I stood by the window of my second-floor office. I listened to her hysterical, unhinged screaming echoing through the speaker of my phone. I did not interrupt her. I let her exhaust her lungs. When she finally paused to take a ragged breath, the line fell totally silent. I spoke with a voice completely devoid of emotion. I told her she had miscalculated the consequences of her betrayal. I reminded her of the exact moment my heart stopped beating inside the ambulance. I reminded her of the choice she made to prioritize a cocktail party over my survival. I said clearly and definitively that I died for 22 seconds, Valerie. Your money died with me. I pressed the button and terminated the call. Valerie stared at the dark screen of her phone. She let out a sound that was half sob and half scream. She looked at Heather. They were stranded in the city. They were completely cut off from their luxurious reality. The legal and financial walls had trapped them perfectly. They realized I was not hiding. I was orchestrating their downfall from a position of absolute power. Heather grabbed Valerie's arm. She knew they could not fight a digital war. They needed to confront me physically to force a concession. Heather knew my exact habits. She knew that after a long day of securing the commercial freight lines, I invariably retreated to a very specific, quiet location away from the corporate headquarters. They rushed toward Heather's parked car. They tracked my location directly to my favorite worn-down 24-hour diner on the edge of the industrial district. The diner smelled of stale grease and burnt coffee. It was a smell I had known for 40 years. It was a smell that grounded me in absolute reality. I sat in the corner booth. The red vinyl seats were cracked and patched with silver duct tape. The flickering neon sign buzzed loudly against the wet window pane. I cut a piece of my well-done steak. I chewed it slowly. I watched the rain streak down the glass. The diner was completely empty except for the tired waitress wiping down the long laminate counter. This was my sanctuary. This was the place I came to think when the logistics empire required brutal, uncompromising decisions. The heavy glass door swung open. A gust of cold wind swept through the diner. Valerie walked through the door. Heather walked closely behind her. Jordan trailed behind them. Alicia followed last. They looked entirely out of place in the grimy diner. Their designer clothes were wrinkled and damp from the rain. Their faces were pale and exhausted. They looked like refugees fleeing from a war they had started. They spotted me in the corner booth. They marched across the checkered linoleum floor. I did not stop cutting my steak. I watched them approach. I looked at Jordan. I looked at Alicia. I remembered a time before the luxury cars and the offshore bank accounts. I remembered a time before greed completely infected their minds. I brought them to this exact diner every single Sunday. We sat in this exact red vinyl booth. I bought them massive stacks of buttermilk pancakes. I bought them chocolate milkshakes in tall glass cups. They used to smile genuine smiles. They used to tell me about their school projects and their childhood dreams. They were innocent. They were grateful. They were a family. The money destroyed all of that. The wealth acted as a slow, creeping poison. It eroded their character. It eroded their empathy. It replaced their souls with an endless, insatiable appetite for more. They did not see me as a father anymore. They only saw a walking bank vault. They stood over my table. The innocence was gone forever. Valerie slid into the booth opposite me. Heather squeezed in next to her. Jordan and Alicia stood awkwardly in the narrow aisle. The performance began immediately. They deployed their tears like tactical weapons. They weaponized their guilt. They attempted to manipulate my emotions. Valerie reached across the sticky table. She tried to grab my hand. I pulled my hand back and picked up my fork. She began to sob loudly. She begged for a financial lifeline. She claimed they were completely stranded in the city. She stated that Heather had been forced to beg a predatory bail bondsman just to secure Jordan's release from the holding cell. She cried that Bradley was still locked inside the county jail because her platinum cards were entirely worthless. She cried that the family was entirely broken. Alicia chimed in. She wiped dramatic tears from her perfectly contoured cheeks. She sobbed about her ruined digital reputation. She wailed that her social media sponsors were actively terminating her contracts because the public knew the absolute truth about her lies. Heather begged for cash to save their luxury condominium from immediate foreclosure. Jordan stared at the floor. He displayed the dark purple bruising on his jaw and the dried blood on his collar from his brutal fistfight with Bradley. He muttered a pathetic apology. He mumbled that he never meant for things to escalate to physical violence. He claimed he was simply trying to survive the fallout. He wanted me to look at his injuries and feel the paternal instinct to protect him. They were crying. They were begging. They were performing. I listened to their desperate chorus. I did not feel an ounce of pity. I did not feel a shred of remorse. I cut another piece of steak. I placed it in my mouth. I chewed it deliberately. I tasted the salt and the char. I swallowed. I placed my knife and fork down on the thick porcelain plate. I reached into the inside pocket of my heavy trench coat. I bypassed my wallet. I pulled out a single neatly folded sheet of heavy white paper. I placed it flat on the table. I used my index finger to slide the document directly toward Valerie. I did not say a single word until the paper rested entirely on her side of the booth. I explained the contents of the document with absolute chilling clarity. I told them the paper was a comprehensive, legally binding confession. It detailed the entire scope of their criminal conspiracy. It outlined the fabrication of the medical incapacity certificate. It outlined the illegal attempt to seize the corporate emergency reserves. It outlined the unauthorized credit card theft and the massive accumulation of hidden debt. I told them it was a full admission of medical fraud and financial theft. I made sure they understood the severe legal ramifications of every single paragraph. I offered them a single final ultimatum. I presented two distinct choices. Option 1 required every single person standing at the table to sign the document immediately. If they signed the confession, I promised to instruct Gallagher to drop all pending criminal charges. I promised to halt the police investigations. They would avoid federal prison. They would not face a judge. However, they would leave the diner with absolutely nothing. They would walk away from the logistics empire, the estate, and the bank accounts with zero financial backing. They would be forced to work for their survival exactly like the employees they had always despised. Option 2 was entirely unforgiving. If they refused to sign the confession, the negotiation was permanently terminated. I promised them that Gallagher was currently sitting in his office, holding the complete, unredacted dossier of their crimes. If they rejected my offer, Gallagher would hand the entire file directly to the regional director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation at exactly 8 o'clock in the morning. The federal authorities would pursue the medical fraud and the attempted corporate embezzlement with maximum prejudice. They would face decades of incarceration. Their names would be permanently synonymous with corporate crime. I looked directly at Valerie. I looked at Alicia, Heather, and Jordan. I told them the choice was entirely theirs. Valerie stared at the white paper resting on the table. The tears instantly vanished from her eyes. The desperate pleading facade evaporated completely. Her toxic pride violently reasserted itself. She read the brutal terms of the confession. She realized I was completely serious. She realized I was entirely willing to sever the family permanently to protect the company. Her face contorted into a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. She refused to accept a life without luxury. She refused to walk away empty-handed after decades of enjoying my wealth. She snatched the paper from the table. She gripped it with both hands. She tore the document forcefully in half. She threw the torn pieces back across the table. The white scraps landed near my plate. Valerie slid out of the vinyl booth. She stood up tall. She pointed a manicured finger directly at my face. She screamed that I would never force her to live like a peasant. She declared she would never sign away her rights. She swore she would find a lawyer ruthless enough to bypass the post-nuptial agreement. She promised to hire the most vicious, aggressive shark attorney in the entire state. She claimed she would sue me for permanent, exorbitant alimony. She stated she would drag the divorce out until I died of old age. She promised a brutal, relentless civil war. She ordered her children to follow her. She turned and marched out of the diner into the cold, pouring rain. Alicia, Heather, and Jordan cast one final terrified glance at me before hurrying out the door after her. I watched the glass door swing shut. I picked up my coffee cup. I took a slow sip. The battle in the shadows was over. The public war was officially declared. Valerie made good on her threat before the rain from the diner parking lot had dried on her designer coat. She secured the services of Sterling Vance, the most notoriously aggressive divorce litigator in the state. Vance was a legal mercenary. He did not negotiate equitable settlements. He specialized in scorched earth litigation designed to psychologically and financially break the opposing party. 2 days after the diner confrontation, Vance dispatched a courier to my executive office. The courier delivered a massive leather-bound binder containing a preliminary declaration of war. Vance demanded an astronomical spousal support stipend. He demanded exclusive access to the corporate logistics accounts to fund his own exorbitant retainer. He attached a personalized letter promising to drag the civil proceedings out for a decade. He threatened to appeal every single ruling up to the state Supreme Court. He intended to bury my company in a blizzard of invasive discovery motions, forensic audits, and relentless depositions. He threatened to subpoena my regional managers, shipping partners, and warehouse supervisors to disrupt my operations. He planned to bleed my operational capital entirely dry until I capitulated to Valerie's demands simply to stop the catastrophic financial hemorrhage. Valerie desperately needed to project an aura of absolute invincibility. She knew the rumors of her catastrophic downfall were beginning to circulate through the elite country clubs and charity boards she frequented. She refused to allow high society to witness her bleed. To counteract the whispers, she orchestrated a spectacularly lavish gala. She rented the grand ballroom of the city's most exclusive hotel. She secured the venue by leveraging the dangerous high-interest loan she had acquired to pay Vance's initial legal fees. She ordered thousands of dollars in imported floral arrangements. She hired a 20-piece classical orchestra to provide the evening's soundtrack. She mandated a strict black-tie dress code to guarantee the visual perfection of the event. She invited every major socialite, corporate rival, and politician in her contact list. She intended to stand in the center of the ballroom covered in diamonds holding a crystal flute of vintage champagne and demonstrate to the world that she was entirely untouched by my ultimatums. She wanted to cement her status as a wealthy, untouchable matriarch who had defeated her husband. She remained entirely unaware that her arrogant display was built on a foundation of severe federal crimes. While she was busy selecting ice sculptures and reviewing catering menus, Gallagher and I sat in the quiet isolation of my secure conference room. We did not panic over Vance's aggressive legal threats. We opened the heavy fireproof safe behind my desk and extracted the master financial ledger. For the past 5 years, Valerie firmly believed she was a mastermind of financial deception. She thought she was brilliantly outsmarting my corporate auditors. Whenever she desired a new luxury vehicle, an exorbitant piece of jewelry, or a spontaneous vacation to the French Riviera, she did not use the standard family accounts. She believed those accounts were too closely monitored. Instead, she systematically established a complex web of domestic limited liability companies and offshore shell corporations. She needed clean names to serve as the registered directors for these fraudulent entities. She ruthlessly utilized the identities of Alicia and Jordan. She forged their signatures on critical incorporation documents. She manipulated their social security numbers to open illicit lines of credit. She routed millions of dollars in untaxed, diverted revenue through these ghost companies to fund her extravagant lifestyle. She believed she was successfully hiding her personal wealth from family court. She believed she had constructed an impenetrable financial fortress that I could never touch. She was profoundly mistaken. Valerie was not a financial genius. She lacked the fundamental discipline to cover her digital tracks. She left a massive, undeniable paper trail of unfiled tax returns, fraudulent asset declarations, and illegal wire transfers. She thought she was engaging in clever marital sabotage. In absolute reality, she was actively committing massive, heavily documented federal tax evasion. I refused to engage in a prolonged, draining civil war in a local family court. I refused to allow Sterling Vance to turn my logistics empire into his personal billing mechanism. I instructed Gallagher to completely bypass the local judiciary. We bypassed the divorce proceedings entirely. Gallagher compiled every forged signature, every fraudulent wire transfer, and every hidden bank statement into a meticulously organized 300-page dossier. He did not file this dossier with a civil judge. He submitted the entire package directly to the Criminal Investigation Division of the Internal Revenue Service. Gallagher operated with ruthless, calculated efficiency. As soon as the federal agency confirmed receipt of the master dossier, he dispatched a single, heavily encrypted email to Sterling Vance. Gallagher attached the federal tracking numbers and a brief summary of the exact charges Valerie was about to face. He included clear, undeniable evidence that Vance's initial retainer was paid using funds directly tied to the fraudulent shell companies. Vance received the email while sitting behind his mahogany desk. He read the summary. He reviewed the attached federal statutes. Vance was an aggressive shark in family court, but he possessed a deep, abiding terror of the federal government. He recognized immediately that the money he had accepted was highly radioactive. He knew that continuing to represent Valerie would instantly implicate him in a federal money laundering conspiracy. He knew it would result in his immediate disbarment and certain incarceration. Vance did not hesitate for a single second. He drafted a formal notice of withdrawal. He terminated his attorney-client relationship with Valerie permanently and completely. He then wired the remaining balance of her retainer directly into a federal holding account to protect his own legal license. Valerie remained entirely ignorant of her sudden lack of legal representation. She stood proudly in the center of the grand ballroom, draped in a stunning, custom-made silk gown. The massive crystal chandeliers cast a brilliant, sparkling light across the room. The orchestra played a sweeping, elegant waltz. The ballroom was packed with the city's elite. Valerie smiled brightly. She laughed at polite jokes. She projected the flawless, manufactured image of a woman who possessed absolute control over her destiny. Alicia and Jordan stood nervously near the edges of the room, acutely aware of the fabricated reality surrounding them. The heavy oak doors of the grand ballroom suddenly swung open with violent force. They did not open for a late-arriving guest. They opened for a team of 12 stern, unsmiling federal agents. The agents wore dark tactical windbreakers with the bright yellow letters of the IRS emblazoned across their backs. They marched into the elegant venue with aggressive, undeniable authority. The sweeping music of the orchestra ground to a chaotic, dissonant halt. The polite conversations of the elite guests instantly vanished. A suffocating, terrified silence fell over the massive room. The lead federal agent bypassed the catering tables and the shocked socialites. He walked directly toward the center of the ballroom. He stopped directly in front of Valerie. He did not lower his voice. He loudly informed her that all of her assets were officially seized by the federal government. He stated she was under immediate arrest for multiple counts of aggravated tax evasion and identity theft. The flawless facade shattered into a million irreparable pieces as the cold steel handcuffs locked securely around her wrists. The federal agents marched Valerie through the gilded lobby of the luxury hotel. Her custom silk gown dragged heavily across the polished marble. The cold steel of the handcuffs dug into her wrists. A crowd of high society socialites and corporate rivals spilled out of the grand ballroom. They followed the grim procession, holding champagne flutes and whispering behind raised hands. Valerie kept her head down. She frantically tried to hide her face from the glowing screens of smartphones recording her spectacular downfall. Her mind raced with delusional escape plans. She believed that if she could simply reach her vehicle, she could lock the doors, hide from the cameras, and buy her way out of this nightmare. The electronic glass doors parted. The agents escorted her onto the circular valet driveway. Valerie immediately spotted her pristine pearl-white luxury SUV parked near the front of the line. She dug her heels into the concrete. She violently twisted her shoulders and attempted to pull away from the federal agents. She shrieked at the terrified young valet attendant. She ordered him to open the heavy doors. She demanded he start the engine immediately. She wanted to dive into the leather interior and completely vanish from the humiliating gaze of the elite guests watching her public destruction. The valet attendant did not move. He backed away slowly. The grinding roar of an industrial diesel engine shattered the tense silence of the hotel driveway. A massive, heavy-duty commercial tow truck backed aggressively into the circular loading zone. Its flashing amber lights cast harsh strobing shadows across the elegant architecture of the hotel portico. The tow truck driver threw the massive vehicle into park. He engaged the hydraulic winch. The heavy steel chains rattled loudly against the pavement. The driver expertly hooked the carriage of Valerie's pristine SUV. The hydraulic lift engaged with a loud whine. The rear tires of the luxury vehicle lifted violently off the concrete. Valerie stopped fighting the agents. She stared at the tow truck in absolute horror. She screamed at the driver to drop her vehicle. She shrieked that she was the primary owner and threatened to have him arrested for grand theft auto. Her voice cracked with pure hysteria. She turned to the crowd of socialites and begged someone to intervene. The crowd remained entirely silent. They only watched the absolute dismantling of the woman who had spent years looking down on them. I stepped out from the deep shadows of the stone valet portico. The flashing amber lights of the tow truck reflected off my heavy trench coat. I walked across the circular driveway with slow, deliberate, measured steps. The high society guests parted instantly to let me through. The federal agents recognized me. They paused their forward momentum. They allowed me to step directly into Valerie's line of sight. She looked at me. Her mascara was smeared down her cheeks. Her custom gown was ruined. She demanded to know why a commercial tow truck was currently stealing her personal vehicle. She ordered me to stop the driver. She still fundamentally believed she possessed the authority to command me. She still believed she owned the ground she stood on. I looked at the suspended luxury SUV. I looked back at her desperate, tear-streaked face. I did not raise my voice. I spoke with absolute terrifying calm. I explained the fundamental reality of her entire existence. For the past 2 decades, she had proudly flaunted her extreme wealth to the world. She had mocked my simple work boots and my rusted delivery trucks. But she never bothered to read the foundational corporate bylaws. Every single status symbol she possessed was entirely an illusion. Her designer wardrobe, her diamond necklaces, and her pearl-white luxury SUV were not her personal property. They were strictly classified as executive corporate leases. They were owned completely and exclusively by the logistics company. Because she had actively committed massive federal tax fraud and corporate embezzlement against the parent company, every single lease was instantly and irrevocably voided. The freight company was officially repossessing its assets. She owned absolutely nothing. Valerie began to hyperventilate. I reached into the inside pocket of my trench coat. I pulled out a thick manila envelope and held it out to her. The federal agent lightly gripped her shoulder as I placed the envelope firmly under her bound hands. I told her exactly what the envelope contained. It held the finalized court-approved divorce decree. The document legally severed our marriage with extreme prejudice. It explicitly stripped her of any claim to alimony, spousal support, or corporate equity due to her documented criminal behavior. I informed her that the second document inside the envelope was the formal Internal Revenue Service audit summons. It detailed the exact timeline of her impending federal prosecution. It listed the catastrophic fines and the mandatory minimum prison sentences associated with her shell companies. I told her the charade was permanently finished. The corporate bank accounts were closed. The shell companies were seized. Her aggressive shark attorney had abandoned her. She was entirely bankrupt, facing federal prison and standing in front of the entire city stripped of her manufactured dignity. Valerie's knees buckled. The federal agents had to physically support her weight to keep her from collapsing onto the wet concrete. She looked desperately toward the heavy glass doors of the hotel lobby. Alicia and Jordan slowly emerged from the grand entrance. They had watched the entire confrontation from the safety of the interior vestibule. They saw the federal agents. They saw the tow truck hauling away the luxury vehicle. They saw the absolute crushing finality of the manila envelope. Valerie sobbed. She pleaded with her children. She begged them to call their own lawyers. She begged them to empty their personal savings to secure her bail. She cried out that she had committed the tax fraud entirely to protect their inheritance. Alicia stopped walking. She looked at the flashing lights of the tow truck. She looked at the stern faces of the federal agents. She looked at the ruined, hysterical woman begging for salvation. Alicia's survival instinct kicked in with predatory speed. She took a deliberate physical step backward. She shook her head. She loudly declared to the federal agents that she had absolutely no knowledge of any tax evasion. She claimed her mother had forged her signatures on the shell company documents without her consent. Jordan did not hesitate. He immediately followed his sister's lead. He raised his hands in the air and backed away from the curb. He threw his mother directly into the federal fire to save his own skin. He loudly corroborated Alicia's story. He claimed Valerie was a controlling tyrant who had orchestrated the entire criminal enterprise entirely on her own. They both turned their backs on the woman who had spent 30 years teaching them how to be ruthless. They walked rapidly back into the hotel lobby and disappeared into the crowd, leaving Valerie completely and utterly alone with her federal captors. I stood on the wet concrete and watched the ultimate betrayal. I watched the toxic alliance consume itself. I watched the children of greed sacrifice their own mother for a fleeting chance at self-preservation. They were cowards. They were scavengers. They would spend the rest of their miserable lives tearing each other apart for the remaining scraps of a ruined legacy. The federal agents firmly turned Valerie around. They guided her toward the back of the dark government vehicle. She did not scream anymore. She did not fight. She was entirely broken. The heavy door slammed shut, sealing her fate. I turned my back on the flashing lights and the whispering crowd. I walked across the massive parking lot toward the far unlit corner of the property. I did not walk toward a sleek corporate sedan. I walked toward a heavily weathered, rusted delivery truck. It was the very first vehicle I had ever purchased. It was the original foundation of my entire logistics empire. It represented honest labor, unfiltered truth, and the brutal reality of the supply chain. I climbed into the worn driver's seat. I closed the heavy metal door. I inserted the brass key into the ignition. The old diesel engine roared to life with a loud, comforting rumble. I gripped the cracked steering wheel. I shifted the heavy transmission into gear. I pressed my foot against the accelerator. I drove the truck forward, pulling away from the luxury hotel and the shattered remnants of a parasitic family. I drove into the dark, unending night. I smiled. The adjustment was complete. True wealth is never measured by the luxury vehicles in your driveway or the designer labels hanging in your closet. Real prosperity is forged entirely through unyielding honesty, relentless hard work, and maintaining absolute integrity when the world demands compromise. Greed acts as a slow poison that completely destroys families from the inside out. When you build your life on a foundation of manipulation and entitlement, your entire empire will inevitably collapse into absolute ruin. Protect your peace and never surrender your dignity. Share your thoughts on this story in the comments below and subscribe for more powerful daily content.